The first shot split the evening air like thunder across the plains. The second followed before the echo of the first had faded. Inside Hannigan's saloon, glasses rattled, conversations died, and a dozen weathered faces turned toward the swinging doors. Elias McGraw didn't move. He sat at the corner table where he always sat when he came to town, nursing the same whiskey he'd been nursing for the past hour. His leathered hands, scarred from decades of work and war, remained steady around the glass. Only his eyes, pale blue under the shadow of his hat brim, shifted toward the commotion. "Someone ought to fetch the sheriff," a woman said from behind the bar. But Sheriff Riley was 3 towns over chasing cattle rustlers, and everyone in Redemption knew it. That's why Trouble had chosen today to visit. The third shot came followed by a man's scream. Elias set his glass down with a gentle click against the worn table. He was 58 years old, his beard more salt than pepper. His shoulders still broad but beginning to bow under the weight of time. He wasn't looking for trouble. He hadn't looked for trouble in nearly 20 years. "Give me everything in the safe, old man, or the next one goes through your skull." The voice from outside belonged to a stranger, but its kind was familiar to Elias. Young, drunk on power and whiskey, the voice of a man who'd discovered that fear was currency in these parts. The barkeeper's eyes found Elias. "Mr. McGraw." Elias shook his head, once picked up his glass and drained the last of the amber liquid. 20 years ago, he would have already been through those doors. 20 years ago, he would have been lightning in human form. But that was before Sarah, before the war, before Thomas left. Another shot, glass shattering. "You got till I count to fear one." Hannigan's was the only store in 50 miles that extended credit to the smaller ranchers during dry seasons. Old man Hannigan had carried half the families in the county through the drought. 3 years back. 2. Elias stood. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots as he moved toward the door, each step deliberate, unhurried. The patrons parted like water. 3. His hand moved to his hip, where the Colt's single-action army rested in its worn holster. The gun was as much a part of him as his right arm, though he'd hoped never to use it for anything but hunting again. 4. Elias pushed through the doors and stepped onto the porch. The evening sun hung low, painting the dusty street in gold and blood. In its light stood 3 men, 2 on horseback and 1 on foot, holding a gun to Hannigan's head outside the general store. "Feet." "That'll do," Elias said, his voice quiet but carrying on the still air. The gunman's head snapped toward him. Young, maybe 25, with a face that might have been handsome if not twisted by cruelty. His companions were cut from the same cloth, trail dust and malice. "This ain't your business, old-timer," the gunman said, pressing the barrel harder against Hannigan's temple. The storekeeper winced, his round face pale with fear. "Walk away while you still can." Elias didn't move. "Let him go." The gunman laughed, a sound like stones rattling in a tin can. "Or what? Oh, you'll hobble at me." Elias said nothing. He stood perfectly still, silhouetted against the dying light. Behind him, faces appeared in the saloon windows, watching. "I said walk away." The gunman's voice rose, the first hint of uncertainty creeping in. "Can't do that," Elias replied. The moment stretched taut as a fiddle string. Then the gunman made his decision. His arm swung toward Elias' gun barrel glinting in the sunset. What happened next seemed impossible to those watching. One moment Elias stood empty-handed. The next, the Colt appeared in his grip as if conjured from thin air. A single shot rang out clean and sharp. The gunman's weapon clattered to the dirt. He followed a second later, clutching his shattered wrist, screaming curses that turned to whimpers. The 2 mounted men reached for their guns, but froze when they found themselves staring down Elias's barrel. "I wouldn't," Elias said. They believed him. Within minutes, all 3 men were disarmed and tied to the hitching post. Hannigan, shaking but unhurt, clapped Elias on the shoulder. "Lightning Hand McGraw," he said with something like awe. "Thought that man was long gone." Elias holstered his weapon. "He is." "Not from where I'm standing." Hannigan gestured to the captured men. "That was the fastest draw I've seen in 20 years. "Let's keep it that way," Elias replied, pulling his hat lower. 20 years between. Deputy Marshal Collins arrived an hour later, a young man with earnest eyes and a badge too shiny for the frontier. He took statements, arranged for the prisoner's transport, and finally approached Elias as he prepared to leave town. "Mr. McGraw," Collins called, jogging to catch up. I wanted to thank you for what you did. Elias mounted his horse an aging chestnut gelding that had seen almost as many miles as he had. Just happened to be there. All the same it was. Collins paused, searching for words. Well, folks are saying it was like watching a legend come back to life. Elias sighed. Legends should stay buried, deputy. Next time there's trouble, you be here to handle it. That's what the badge is for. Collins nodded, chastened but still admiring. Yes, sir, but if you hadn't been there today. But I was, Elias cut him off, and now I'm heading home. He turned his horse toward the trail that led north toward Broken Wheel Ranch. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a sky streaked with crimson and purple. Elias rode in silence, the rhythmic hoofbeats of familiar comfort. The land around him was harsh but beautiful, rolling hills giving way to craggy plateaus, scrub brush and cacti dotting the landscape. In the distance, the silhouette of mountains reminded him how small a man truly was. This country had a way of making that point clear. As the last light faded and stars began to emerge, Elias allowed his thoughts to drift. 20 years since he'd used his gun against a man. 20 years of trying to bury Lightning Hand McGraw under calluses and quiet days. Yet the name followed him like a shadow. Before the war, he'd been a bounty hunter of some renown, tracking fugitives across territories where law was more suggestion than rule. He'd been good at it, too good. The speed of his draw became the stuff of whispered stories in saloons from Texas to Montana. Then came the war between the states. Elias fought for the Union not out of any great political conviction, but because it seemed the right thing to do. 4 years of hell watching boys die in mud and fire. By the time it ended, something in him had changed. He returned to find Sarah waiting, patient and loving as always. They married, bought land, and for a time, Elias thought he might outrun his reputation. They had a son, Thomas, and Elias swore the boy would grow up knowing his father as a rancher, not a killer. But fate had other ideas. Sarah died of fever when Thomas was 16. The boy blamed Elias for not being there when she fell ill, for not getting the doctor faster, for 100 things that Elias blamed himself for too. Words were exchanged that couldn't be taken back, and Thomas left riding east without looking back. That was 15 years ago. Sometimes Elias wondered if his son was even alive. The trail narrowed as it wound through a stand of cottonwoods that marked the northern boundary of his property. Lightning Creek ran through here, a precious source of water that had sustained Broken Wheel through drought and hardship. The sound of it rushing over stones brought Elias back to the present. Home was just ahead, a sturdy 2-room cabin with a porch that caught the morning sun, a barn that leaned slightly to the south corrals, and outbuildings. Not much to show for a life's work, but it was his. As he approached the barn, something made him pull up short. Tobias, his old cattle dog, wasn't there to greet him. The animal always waited by the gate when Elias went to town, as regular as sunset. Tobias, Elias called softly. No response, but now he noticed something else. The barn door stood slightly ajar, though he distinctly remembered latching it that morning. Elias dismounted slowly, his hand moving to his holster. He looped the reins over the fence post and approached the barn with measured steps. The night was quiet. Too quiet. No sounds of his horses moving in their stalls, no rustle of chickens settling for the night. He pushed the door open, with the barrel of his Colt wincing at the creak of hinges. Darkness greeted him, thick and impenetrable. Elias reached for the lantern he kept just inside, struck a match, and raised the light. The soft glow revealed Tobias first lying on his side near the door. For a moment, Elias's heart stopped, then he saw the gentle rise and fall of the dog's ribs. Sleeping, not dead. But why here and not at his post? The answer came in a flurry of movement from the far corner. A shadow lunged, then stumbled. Something metallic clattered against the barn floor. Elias raised his gun, and the lantern higher, illuminating a figure pressed against the wall. A woman. Young mid-20s perhaps, with tangled auburn hair and eyes wide with fear. Her clothes were travel-worn and stained, her face smudged with dirt. But what caught Elias's attention was the dark patch spreading across her left shoulder and the way she cradled her arm against her body. "Don't move," Elias said, his voice low. The woman's eyes darted to the side where a bridle lay on the ground. Near it was the pitchfork she must have knocked over in her haste. "Were you trying to steal my horse?" Elias asked. She didn't answer, but the truth was written in the guilty shift of her eyes. "You're hurt," he observed, nodding toward her shoulder. She laughed, then a harsh, brittle sound that contained no mirth. Astute observation, sir. Elias kept the gun steady but lowered the lantern to the workbench. Who are you running from? The woman's laugh died, replaced by a coldness that seemed to age her. Their justice. Whose justice? Does it matter? She pushed herself away from the wall, wincing as the movement jarred her injured shoulder. You'll either turn me in or shoot me, so what difference does it make who's hunting me? Elias studied her. Despite her defiance, exhaustion radiated from her in waves. She swayed slightly on her feet, and he suspected it was only pride keeping her upright. I'm not in the habit of shooting trespassers, he said, or turning in folks I don't know to people I don't know. Something flickered across her face, hope quickly suppressed. Then you'll let me take a horse. Didn't say that either. Elias holstered his weapon slowly. But I won't leave an injured woman in my barn with night coming on. There's a room in the house. You can clean up, tend that wound, and we'll talk about what happens next in the morning. Suspicion narrowed her eyes. Why would you help me? It was a fair question, one Elias wasn't entirely sure he had an answer to. Perhaps it was the weariness he recognized in her, the look of someone who'd been running too long. Or perhaps, after 20 years of solitude, he'd simply forgotten how to turn away a soul in need. Because I can, he said finally, and out here that's reason enough. The woman stared at him for a long moment, then nodded once, a sharp movement that seemed to cost her. One night, then I'll be gone. Your choice, Elias replied. What's your name? She hesitated, calculating. Grace, she said finally. Grace Armstrong. Elias nodded, not questioning whether it was her real name. Out here a person was whoever they claimed to be until proven otherwise. Elias McGraw, he offered in return. Come on, that shoulder needs looking at. He turned, expecting her to follow, and was halfway to the door when he heard the soft thud behind him. Grace had collapsed, her body crumpling like a marionette with cut strings. Elias moved quickly for a man his age, catching her before her head hit the ground. She was lighter than she should have been, all angles and bones beneath her clothes. Her skin burned with fever when he touched her face. Damn it, he muttered. The wound was worse than he'd thought. With a grunt, Elias lifted her into his arms and carried her from the barn, Tobias trailing behind, now awake and watchful. The old dog seemed to approve of the unexpected guest, or at least didn't object to her presence. Inside the cabin, Elias laid Grace on the spare bed, the one that had been Thomas's, and which hadn't held a body in 15 years. He lit lamps, stoked the fire in the stove, and gathered what he needed: clean cloths, a basin of water, whiskey for disinfecting, needle and thread. By morning, Grace's fever had broken. Elias found her standing at his stove, her injured arm held close to her body, pouring coffee with her good hand. She'd washed her face and attempted to tame her hair, though it still fell in wild waves down her back. You should be resting, Elias said, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. I've imposed enough, she replied without turning. Elias accepted the coffee she offered and settled at the table. Then maybe you'd better tell me what you're running from. Grace sat opposite him, movements careful but determined. In the morning light, Elias could see her more clearly, younger than he'd first thought, with a dusting of freckles across her nose. But it was her eyes that held his attention, green as spring grass and harder than they had any right to be in one so young. I'm accused of murder, she said flatly, of killing my husband, Charles Whitfield. Elias didn't let surprise show on his face. Did you know? Grace met his gaze steadily. Elias nodded once. Where's this husband of yours from? Winslow? He was the bank owner there. Quite respected. The last word carried a bitter edge. And who shot you? One of Judge Calder's men. He's determined to see me hang. The name sent a cold current down Elias's spine. Judge Maxwell Calder was known throughout the territory, a powerful man with political ambitions who'd brought a semblance of law to several previously lawless towns. Why would the judge himself take such an interest in your case? Elias asked. Because he was Charles's business partner. And now that Charles is dead, everything goes to him. Grace's laugh was hollow. Convenient, isn't it? You're saying Judge Calder had your husband killed, framed you for it, and is now hunting you down to silence you permanently. I know how it sounds, she said, reading his skepticism. But Charles kept records, a journal detailing their business dealings. Things no upstanding judge would want known. I believe that's why he was killed. And you were the perfect scapegoat. Grace nodded, pain crossing her features that had nothing to do with her physical wound. A wife with a motive? We were not happy. This journal, Elias said. Where is it? Hidden in Charles's study, I think. I never saw it, but I heard them arguing about it the night before he was killed. Calder wanted Charles to destroy it. So you're headed where exactly? With no money, no horse, and a bullet wound? Grace's chin lifted. There's a federal marshal in Fort Gibson who once stood against Calder in court. If I can reach him, tell him what I know. Fort Gibson is 300 miles east, Elias pointed out. You wouldn't make it 50 with that shoulder. I have to try. Determination hardened her voice. I won't hang for a crime I didn't commit. Elias stood and moved to the window. His peaceful existence, hard-won after years of violence, seemed suddenly fragile. Harboring a fugitive, even one he believed might be innocent, was asking for trouble. The smart thing would be to give Grace provisions, point her toward Fort Gibson, and wash his hands of the matter. Rest today, he said instead. I need to go to town for supplies. We'll figure out next steps when I return. Why would you help me? Suspicion and hope warred on Grace's face. Elias reached for his hat. Let's just say I've seen enough hangings to know they don't always find the right neck. The ride to redemption took longer than usual. Elias kept to less traveled paths, eyes scanning the horizon for riders. The town was unusually busy, and he entered the general store through the back door. Marcus Hannigan looked up from his ledger, surprise crossing his round face. Elias twice in 2 days must be some kind of record. Need a few things, Marcus, and information. What kind of information? Marcus closed his ledger. What do you know about Judge Calder over in Winslow? Marcus glanced around, ensuring they were alone. Powerful man, getting more powerful. Word is he's eyeing a Senate seat. Honest, Marcus snorted. As honest as any man who started with nothing and now owns half the county. Heard anything about Charles Whitfield's murder? The banker. Shot in his study 2 nights ago. They're saying his wife did it, young thing he married last year. She's run off and Calder's got his bounty on her head. How much? $500, dead or alive. Marcus studied his old friend. Why the interest, Elias? Just curious. News is scarce out my way. Elias was securing his packages to his saddle when a voice called out from the street. Mr. McGraw, a moment if you please. He turned to find Deputy Marshal Collins approaching, flanked by 2 strangers in town clothes that didn't quite fit with the watchful eyes of men accustomed to looking for trouble. Deputy, Elias greeted him, keeping his tone neutral. Collins looked uncomfortable. These gentlemen are from Winslow. They have some questions they'd like to ask you. The taller of the 2 stepped forward. Lawrence Reed, Special Deputy to Judge Calder. This is my associate, Mr. Hayes. Hayes was shorter, with cold eyes and a scar that bisected his left eyebrow. What can I do for you, gentlemen? Elias asked, though he already knew the answer. We're looking for a fugitive. A woman by the name of Grace Whitfield, wanted for the murder of her husband. Haven't heard of her, Elias replied. Reed smiled thinly. That's strange because we tracked her as far as the creek that runs along your property. Bloodhound lost the scent there. Lots of folks cross that creek. It's the main water source for miles. You wouldn't mind if we took a look around your ranch, would you, Mr. McGraw? Just to be thorough. Actually, I would mind. Elias's voice remained level. My land is private property. Unless you have a warrant, you're not welcome there. Reed's smile didn't reach his eyes. That's not very neighborly, Mr. McGraw. Almost makes a man wonder what you might be hiding. Nothing but my privacy, which I value highly. I've heard stories about you, McGraw, Reed said, dropping all pretense of politeness. Lightning Hand, they called you once, a man who could draw and fire before his opponent cleared leather. Stories get exaggerated. Do they Judge Calder has stories about you, too, more recent ones? Reed adjusted his coat, revealing the butt of a pistol at his hip. He said to tell you that he remembers Silver Creek, said you'd know what that means. The name hit Elias like a physical blow. Silver Creek, 1866. One of his last bounties before he'd hung up his guns for good. A man named James Harker, wanted for murder in 3 territories. Except when Elias brought him in, it turned out the evidence had been falsified. Harker was innocent, a fact Elias discovered too late after a hasty trial conducted by a young prosecutor named Maxwell Calder. Harker had gone to the gallows proclaiming his innocence, and Elias had walked away from bounty hunting, forever the blood of an innocent man on his hands. The judge has a good memory, Elias said carefully, and he's very interested in speaking with you again. Reed stepped closer. So if you should happen to come across Mrs. Whitfield, I'd suggest you bring it directly to us, for old time's sake. I'll keep that in mind, Elias replied, the threat clear. Reed nodded satisfied. We'll be visiting every ranch in the area, including yours, Mr. McGraw, with or without a warrant. As the men walked away, Collins lingered, looking troubled. Elias, he said quietly, whatever's going on, be careful. Those men, but Bowie, they're not lawmen like me or Sheriff Riley. They're Judge Calder's personal enforcers. The sun was low on the horizon by the time Elias reached Broken Wheel. The cabin stood quiet in the gathering dusk. Grace sat on the porch steps, Tobias at her feet. She'd found one of his old shirts and was wearing it over her own clothes, the sleeves rolled up to accommodate her bandaged shoulder. You should be inside, he said, dismounting. I've been inside for days. Needed some air. She stood taking one of his packages. There are men looking for me in town, aren't there? Yes, working for Judge Calder. Elias followed her inside. They tracked you as far as the creek. Grace set down the package with a shaking hand. I should go, tonight. And where would you go? They're watching all the roads. I won't bring trouble to your door, she insisted. You've done enough already. Trouble's already here. Elias moved to the stove, stirring the embers back to life. One of those men mentioned Silver Creek to me. Grace frowned. What's Silver Creek? A mistake I made a long time ago, one that Judge Calder apparently hasn't forgotten. Elias straightened, decision made. It seems you and I have a common enemy. What are you saying, Mr. McGraw? I'm saying that running won't solve either of our problems. If Calder is willing to frame you for murder and dredge up Silver Creek to threaten me, he won't stop until we're both silenced. So what do? We find this journal you mentioned, the one that would expose Calder's dealings with your husband. Elias met her gaze steadily. And we use it to clear your name. Hope and disbelief warred on Grace's face. You'd help me with... Elias thought of James Harker, an innocent man he'd helped send to the gallows, of the weight he'd carried for 20 years. Let's just say I have a debt to settle, he replied, one that's long overdue. In Winslow, 20 miles away, Judge Maxwell Calder sat in his study, a glass of brandy in one hand and a telegram in the other. The message was brief: McGraw located, uncooperative, suspect harboring fugitive. Calder smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. He'd waited 20 years for this opportunity to finally settle accounts with Lightning Hand McGraw, the man who'd nearly ruined his career all those years ago. He folded the telegram carefully and dropped it into the fire, watching as the paper blackened and curled. Then he reached for his desk drawer, removing a leather-bound ledger. Within its pages lay enough evidence to destroy him if it ever came to light. But it wouldn't. Grace Whitfield would hang for her husband's murder. Elias McGraw would either die resisting arrest or spend his remaining years in prison for harboring a fugitive. And Judge Maxwell Calder would continue his ascent to power, untroubled by ghosts from the past. Or so he believed as the night deepened around Broken Wheel Ranch and two unlikely allies began to plan their resistance against the coming storm. Dawn came slowly to Broken Wheel Ranch, pink light creeping across the horizon and painting the weathered boards of the cabin. Elias had been awake for hours, seated at his kitchen table, cleaning his Colt with the methodical precision of a man who'd performed the task thousands of times. The familiar smell of gun oil filled the small room. Grace emerged from the spare bedroom, her hair damp from washing her injured shoulder, moving with less stiffness than the day before. She paused in the doorway, watching Elias's hands work. You handle that gun like it's part of you, she observed. Elias didn't look up. Was once. Lightning Hand McGraw. Grace moved to the stove where coffee percolated. I've heard stories. Now Elias did look up, surprise evident in his weathered face. Where'd you hear that name? My father was a lawman in Kansas before we moved east. Grace poured 2 cups of coffee, carrying them to the table. He kept newspaper clippings about notable bounty hunters. Said it helped him know who he could trust if he needed outside help. And what did he think of me? Elias asked, setting the clean gun aside. Grace handed him a cup. He said you were the fastest draw he'd ever seen, but more importantly, you brought men in alive when others brought them in dead. A shadow crossed Elias's face. Not always. Silver Creek. Grace settled across from him, cradling her own cup. Elias nodded, his eyes distant. 1866. James Harker, wanted for the murder of a county judge and his family in Montana Territory. I tracked him for 2 weeks, finally caught up to him near Silver Creek. And I brought him in alive, handed him over to the territorial court where a young prosecutor named Maxwell Calder was building a name for himself. Elias's voice hardened. Calder pushed for a quick trial. Got one. Harker was convicted and hanged within a week. But he was innocent, Grace said softly, seeing the truth in Elias's face. I found out 3 days after the hanging. A witness came forward, said Harker had been with him 100 miles away when the murders happened. Elias took a long drink of his coffee. I confronted Calder. Turned out he'd suppressed evidence, bribed witnesses. He was building his reputation on convictions, didn't much care if they were just. What happened? Nothing. Bitterness crept into Elias's voice. By then, Harker was dead. Calder was protected by powerful friends, and he trailed off. You hung up your guns, Grace finished for him. Tried to. Fought in the war for a while, then came here to start over. Elias gestured to the cabin around them. Thought I'd left all that behind. Grace studied him, understanding dawning in her eyes. And now Calder's a judge with even more power to corrupt the law. And a woman he's framed for murder has shown up at my door. Elias smiled grimly. Fate has a twisted sense of humor. Or justice, Grace suggested. Maybe this is your chance to make things right. Maybe. Elias stood strapping his gun belt around his waist. But first we need to understand exactly what we're up against. Tell me everything you know about Calder and your husband's business dealings. Grace's face darkened. Charles didn't share much with me. Our marriage was, she hesitated, searching for words, not a partnership. But I overheard things. Charles and Calder were investing heavily in land along the proposed railroad route. That's not unusual. Half the speculators in the territory are doing the same. Yes, but they weren't just buying land. They were forcing people out. Grace's hands tightened around her cup. Charles would call in loans, suddenly giving people no time to pay. Calder would ensure the foreclosure proceedings went through his court, where he'd rule in the bank's favor. And then they'd buy the land cheap. Elias nodded, understanding. Still, that's underhanded business, but not necessarily murder. There's more, Grace continued. About a month ago, I overheard them arguing about the shipments. Charles was nervous, said the risk was too great. Calder told him the profits were worth it. Shipments of what? I don't know for certain, but twice I saw crates being loaded at night behind the bank, armed men guarding them. Grace met Elias's gaze. Whatever was in those crates, it wasn't money. Elias frowned. Guns, maybe? There's good money in selling weapons to both sides in the Indian conflicts. Possibly. All I know is that Charles became increasingly anxious in the weeks before his death. He started keeping a journal locked in his desk drawer. I saw him writing in it late at night. And that's what we need to find, Elias concluded. Proof of Calder's illegal activities. If it still exists, Grace pointed out, Calder may have already destroyed it. Maybe, but men like Calder often make one critical mistake: they believe themselves untouchable. Elias checked the load in his revolver before holstering it. We need to get into Winslow and find that journal. Grace looked surprised. I can't go back there. Every lawman and bounty hunter in the territory will be looking for me. They're looking for Grace Whitfield, the banker's wife, Elias corrected. Not a young cowhand riding with his uncle. Understanding dawned on Grace's face. You want me to disguise myself as a man? It's not ideal, but it's our best chance. Cut your hair, bind that chest, wear some old clothes, you'll pass at a distance. We'll ride into Winslow after dark, find the journal, and be gone before morning. Grace touched her long auburn hair unconsciously. And if we're caught, then I'll do what I've spent 20 years trying not to do, Elias replied grimly, patting his holster. They spent the day preparing. Elias mended an old saddle while Grace altered a set of his younger clothes to fit her smaller frame. With scissors and grim determination, she cut her long hair to just below her ears, transforming her appearance remarkably. When she donned the men's clothing and a wide-brimmed hat, Elias had to admit the disguise was convincing, at least to anyone not looking too closely. As sunset approached, Elias packed saddlebags with provisions, ammunition, and a small amount of money. "We'll leave after dark," he told Grace. "It's about 4 hours to Winslow if we push the horses. We should arrive around midnight, late enough that most folks will be abed early enough that we'll have several hours before dawn." Grace nodded, adjusting the bandage on her shoulder. The wound was healing, but still painful. "What's our story, if anyone asks?" "You're my nephew Daniel, visiting from Colorado. We're passing through Winslow on our way to meet your father in Fort Gibson." Elias checked his rifle, ensuring it was clean and loaded. Simple stories are easiest to remember. "And how do we get into Charles's study? The house will be locked, possibly guarded." "That's where Marcus comes in," Elias replied. "I sent word to him this morning with a ranch hand who was heading to town. He'll meet us on the outskirts of Winslow with information about the Whitfield house, who's watching it, where the entrances are." Grace looked impressed. "You trust this Marcus completely?" "With my life. He and I served together in the war, and he's no friend to corrupt officials. His son-in-law lost his farm to one of Calder's schemes last year." As they saddled the horses in the gathering dusk, Tobias began to bark 3 sharp alerts that signaled approaching riders. Elias grabbed his rifle, motioning for Grace to take cover in the barn. "Stay hidden," he whispered. "If there's trouble, ride east along the creek bed. It'll take you to the old miller's road." Grace hesitated, then squeezed his arm once before disappearing into the shadows of the barn. Elias positioned himself on the porch rifle, resting casually across his knees as 2 riders emerged from the tree line. Relief washed through him as he recognized Deputy Collins's lanky form. The second rider was Marcus Hannigan, his round face serious in the fading light. "Evening, Elias," Collins called, raising a hand in greeting as they approached. "Hope we're not intruding." "Deputy, Marcus." Elias nodded to each man, not lowering his rifle entirely. "Bit late for a social call." The men dismounted, tethering their horses to the hitching post. Marcus glanced nervously at the darkening woods around them. "Couldn't come earlier. Reed and Hayes have been watching the store all day. Only just gave them the slip." Collins climbed the porch steps, keeping his hands visible. "We need to talk, Elias. It's about those men from Winslow." Elias studied the young deputy's face, finding nothing but earnest concern there. "Come inside, then." He led them into the cabin, lighting a lamp but keeping the flame low. Marcus settled his bulk into a chair at the table, while Collins remained standing, hat in hand. "I'll be direct," Collins said. "Reed and Hayes aren't just looking for Grace Whitfield anymore. They're asking questions about you, specific questions about your time as a bounty hunter, about Silver Creek." Elias's expression remained neutral. "That was a long time ago. Not to judge Calder, it seems." Collins set his hat on the table. "They've applied for a warrant to search your property. Should arrive tomorrow or the next day." "On what grounds?" "Harboring a fugitive. Obstruction of justice." Collins looked uncomfortable. "There's more. Reed was in the telegraph office this afternoon sending a message to Calder. I couldn't see all of it, but I caught enough they're suggesting you might have been involved in Whitfield's murder." Elias's eyes narrowed. "That's absurd. I haven't been to Winslow in years." "Doesn't matter," Marcus interjected. "Calder controls the court. If he wants you linked to the murder, he'll manufacture evidence." "Why warn me?" Elias asked Collins directly. "You're risking your badge coming here." The young deputy straightened. "Because my father wore a badge too. Taught me it stands for justice, not power. What Calder's doing isn't justice." Elias nodded slowly, making a decision. "Grace," he called, "you can come out now." All 3 men turned as Grace emerged from the back room, still dressed in her male disguise. Collins's hand instinctively moved toward his gun, then stopped as understanding dawned on his face. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said quietly. "Deputy." Grace removed her hat, running a hand through her newly shortened hair. "I didn't kill my husband." "I believe you," Collins replied, surprising everyone. "Charles Whitfield wasn't well liked, but he was Calder's partner. The judge has too much to gain from his death." Marcus leaned forward. "That's why I came, Elias. Your message said you needed information about the Whitfield house. But going to Winslow now would be walking into a trap. Reed and Hayes have men watching all the roads." "We need to find Charles's journal," Grace explained. "It contains evidence of their illegal dealings." "If such a journal exists, Calder would have seized it immediately," Collins pointed out. "Not necessarily," Grace countered. "Charles was paranoid. He had hiding places even Calder wouldn't know about." Elias paced the small room thinking. We still need to get to Winslow. If not by road, then cross-country. There's another option, Marcus said slowly. Tomorrow's the Territorial Banking Conference in Capital City. Every banker and businessman for 100 miles will be there, including Calder. He's giving the keynote address. Collins nodded. Reed and Hayes will likely accompany him, leaving fewer eyes in Winslow. "And the Whitfield house?" Elias asked. "Sealed by the court," Collins replied. "But as acting lawman in Sheriff Riley's absence, I have access." Elias exchanged a look with Grace. "You'd risk that much?" Collins squared his shoulders. "Like I said, the badge stands for justice. If Calder is corrupting the law for his own gain, that's a threat to everything it represents." "Then we have a plan," Elias decided. "Tomorrow, while Calder is in Capital City, we go to Winslow. Collins gets us into the Whitfield house, we find the journal, and we're gone before Calder returns." "And after?" Marcus asked. "Even with the journal, Calder has influence. He won't go down easily." "One problem at a time," Elias replied. "First we get the evidence. Then we take it to someone with the authority to act on it." "The federal marshal in Fort Gibson," Grace suggested. "Marshal Thornton. He prosecuted Calder years ago for judicial misconduct, but the case fell apart when witnesses disappeared." "Then that's where we'll head after Winslow," Elias agreed, "with evidence in hand." As Marcus and Collins prepared to leave, the deputy pulled Elias aside. "Reed and Hayes won't give up easily. They've got a reputation for bringing in their quarry one way or another." "So did I once," Elias replied quietly. Collins studied him. "The stories about you, Lightning Hand McGraw, they true. Some, not all. They say you never missed, never lost a man you were tracking." Elias's expression hardened. "Until I brought in the wrong man?" "Don't believe everything you hear, deputy." Collins nodded understanding. "Be careful, Elias, and watch your back. I'll meet you at the East Fork of Serpent Creek tomorrow at noon." After the two men had ridden away, disappearing into the darkness, Grace joined Elias on the porch. "Can we trust them?" she asked. "Marcus, absolutely. Collins?" Elias considered. "I believe so. He's young, idealistic. Reminds me a bit of myself before Silver Creek." "We're taking a tremendous risk," Grace observed. "Life is risk," Elias replied simply. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will test us both." They rose before dawn, packed their gear, and set out cross-country, avoiding the main roads. Elias led them through ravines and dry creek beds, along paths known only to local ranchers and wildlife. The terrain was challenging, rocky plateaus giving way to steep gullies, patches of dense scrub alternating with open grassland where they were exposed to any watching eyes. Grace rode well despite her injury, keeping pace with Elias without complaint. They spoke little, conserving energy and maintaining vigilance. By mid-morning, the sun beat down mercilessly, and they paused in the shade of a rock outcropping to rest the horses and drink from their canteens. "How's the shoulder?" Elias asked, noticing Grace's grimace as she dismounted. "Sore but manageable." She flexed the arm carefully. "I won't slow us down." Elias nodded, impressed by her resilience. "We're about an hour from the meeting point. Should reach Winslow by early afternoon." Grace scanned the horizon, shielding her eyes against the glare. "Do you think it's strange that Calder would leave town when he's so intent on finding me?" "Not necessarily. Men like Calder place great value on appearances. Missing the banking conference would raise questions, suggest weakness." Elias checked his pocket watch. "But you're right to be cautious. We'll approach the meeting point carefully." They continued their journey, Elias leading them on an indirect route that utilized natural cover whenever possible. As they neared Serpent Creek, he signaled for Grace to hang back while he scouted ahead. The creek wound through a narrow canyon, its banks lined with cottonwoods and willows that provided good concealment, but also potential ambush points. Elias dismounted, tethering his horse to a twisted juniper, and proceeded on foot, his colt drawn. He moved silently, years of tracking experience evident in every careful step. The only sounds were the gentle burble of the creek and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. Near the fork where they were to meet Collins, Elias paused, senses alert. Something felt wrong. The birds had gone quiet, and there was a faint scent on the breeze that didn't belong to tobacco smoke. He crouched behind a boulder, scanning the clearing ahead. Collins's horse was there, tethered to a tree, but the deputy himself was nowhere in sight. Elias waited, counting his breaths, watching for any movement. It came from the left, a flash of metal among the willows. Elias's gun was up in an instant, aimed at the source. Easy, McGraw, Collins's voice called softly. It's just me. The deputy emerged from the Willow's, hands raised slightly to show he was alone and unarmed. Elias lowered his gun, but didn't holster it. Where's your companion? Collins asked, glancing behind Elias. Safe. Why were you hiding? Collins wiped sweat from his brow. Wasn't sure it would be you coming down that trail. Been some strange traffic this morning, riders asking about an old bounty hunter and a woman. Elias tensed. Reed and Hayes. No, these were different men, rough types, 4 of them heavily armed. Collins moved closer, keeping his voice low. One had a distinctive scar across his chin. Said his name was Vargas. The name hit Elias like a physical blow. Miguel Vargas, a notorious gunman who'd worked as an enforcer for mining companies and cattle barons throughout the territories. Elias had brought in Vargas's brother a decade ago, sending him to prison where he'd died in a riot. Vargas, Elias muttered. Calder's not taking any chances. You know him, Collins asked. We have history, bad history. Elias's mind raced. If Vargas is involved, Calder's playing a deeper game than we thought. This isn't just about silencing Grace anymore. It's about you too, Collins surmised. Silver Creek. Elias nodded grimly. Calder's using this opportunity to settle old scores. Where were these men headed? Broken Wheel. They asked specific directions to your ranch. Elias's jaw tightened. He'd left Tobias at the cabin along with most of his supplies. The thought of Vargas and his men ransacking his home, perhaps harming his loyal dog, filled him with cold anger. Change of plans, he said. I need to go back. That's suicide, Elias, Collins protested. 4 gunmen, maybe more by now. I'm not leaving Tobias to them. Elias's tone brooked no argument, and I need to lead them away from Grace. Collins ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. And Mrs. Whitfield, the journal. The plan stays the same for her. You get her into Winslow, find that journal, and take her to Fort Gibson. Elias turned, preparing to head back up the trail. I'll deal with Vargas, then meet you at Marcus's store tomorrow. Elias, Collins began. There's no debate, deputy. Elias cut him off. Bring Grace here, I'll explain the situation to her. When Grace arrived and heard the change in plans, her reaction was immediate and forceful. Absolutely not, she declared. I won't let you face 4 gunmen alone while I hide in town. You're not letting me do anything, Elias replied evenly. This is my decision. Vargas is my problem. Because of me, Grace countered. I brought this trouble to your door. No, this goes back much further than you. Elias's voice softened slightly. Silver Creek, remember, Calder's had a grudge against me for 20 years. You're just the excuse he needed to act on it. Grace stood her ground. All the more reason we should stick together. Your chances are better with help. My chances are better knowing you're safe and finding that journal, Elias insisted. This isn't a discussion, Grace. Collins will take you to Winslow. I'll handle Vargas and meet you tomorrow. For a moment, it seemed Grace would continue arguing, but something in Elias's expression must have convinced her of his resolve. She stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. Promise me you won't do anything reckless, she said quietly. Just lead them away, then circle back. I promise, Elias replied, though they both knew it might be a promise he couldn't keep. Collins cleared his throat. We should move. If Vargas and his men are at Broken Wheel already, they'll realize soon enough that you're not there. Elias nodded. Take the south road into Winslow. It's longer but less traveled. And Collins, he fixed the deputy with a steady gaze. Keep her safe. You have my word, Collins replied solemnly. As they prepared to part ways, Grace suddenly turned back to Elias. Silver Creek wasn't your fault, she said. Remember that. Before Elias could respond, she mounted her horse and followed Collins down the creek bed, disappearing around a bend in the canyon. Elias watched them go, a strange hollowness in his chest. For 20 years he'd lived alone, the answering to no one, responsible for no one. Now suddenly his actions affected others. Grace, Collins, even Marcus. The realization both weighted and steadied him as he turned his horse north, back toward Broken Wheel Ranch and the men waiting there. Elias approached his property with extreme caution, leaving his horse tethered a half-mile out and proceeding on foot through the woods that bordered the eastern edge of his land. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the clearing where his cabin stood, and he used these for cover as he observed the scene. 4 horses were tethered near his barn, confirming Collins's count. The cabin door stood open, and Elias could see movement inside, men searching, tossing aside furniture, ripping open mattresses. Of Tobias there was no sign, and Elias felt a surge of worry for the old dog. He circled the property, keeping to the tree line, trying to locate all four intruders. Two were inside the cabin, one was checking the barn, but the fourth, Vargas himself, Elias guessed, was nowhere in sight. A twig snapped behind him. Elias whirled, drawing his Colt, but he was a fraction too slow. The barrel of a rifle pressed against the back of his head. "Hello, McGraw," a heavily accented voice said. "Been a long time." Miguel Vargas had aged since Elias last saw him, his black hair now streaked with gray, his face weathered by sun and hard living. But his eyes were the same, cold, calculating, devoid of mercy. The scar Collins had mentioned ran from his chin to his collarbone, disappearing beneath his shirt collar. "Vargas," Elias acknowledged, not lowering his gun. "Still doing other men's dirty work, I see." Vargas's laugh was dry as desert wind. "We all have our talents. Mine is killing. Yours was supposed to be staying out of trouble." He gestured with the rifle. "Drop the gun, you old man." Elias considered his options. At this range, Vargas couldn't miss. Even if Elias managed to get a shot off, the noise would bring the other three running. Slowly, he lowered his Colt to the ground. "Smart," Vargas approved. "Now borrow the woman." "What woman?" Elias asked, playing for time. The rifle barrel pressed harder against his skull. "Don't insult me, McGraw. Grace Whitfield. Judge Calder wants her found, and you too, it seems. Quite a bounty for both of you." "How much?" Elias asked, genuinely curious. 500 for her, 1,000 for you." Vargas chuckled. "The judge must really hate you." "The feeling's mutual," Elias assured him. "Where is she?" Vargas repeated, patience waning. "Gone. Headed for Fort Gibson with evidence of Calder's crimes." It was a calculated risk, but Elias needed to gauge Vargas's reaction. The gunman's face remained impassive. What evidence? A journal. Details of Calder's illegal land deals, weapons shipments, maybe even murder. Now a flicker of interest crossed Vargas's face. "So that's why he's so desperate. Interesting." He gestured with the rifle again. "Move. We're going to join my associates." Elias walked ahead of Vargas toward the cabin, mind racing. The gunman's reaction suggested he hadn't known the full story. Calder was keeping his men in the dark. That could be useful. As they emerged from the trees, the other men spotted them. One, a tall, thin man with a pockmarked face, stepped onto the porch, revolver drawn. "Found him skulking in the woods, Decker," Vargas called. "No sign of the woman." Decker spat tobacco juice onto the dirt. "Place is empty. Looks like they left in a hurry." The other two men emerged, one from the cabin, one from the barn. The latter dragged something behind him, and Elias's heart sank as he recognized Tobias's limp form. "Dog put up a fight," the man said with a cruel grin. "Had to teach it some manners." Anger surged through Elias, hot and fierce. His hands clenched at his sides. "Easy, McGraw," Vargas murmured behind him. "Don't do anything stupid." They led Elias into the cabin, forcing him into a chair at the table. The place was ransacked, drawers emptied onto the floor, furniture overturned, even the stovepipes dismantled in search of hidden items. "Where's the woman, McGraw?" Decker demanded, leaning across the table. "Like I told your boss, she's gone. Headed for Fort Gibson." Elias kept his voice steady, his expression neutral. Decker looked to Vargas, who shrugged. "Could be telling the truth, or she could be hiding nearby. And then we make him tell us where," the third man suggested, a stocky individual with small, cruel eyes. He drew a knife from his boot, testing the edge with his thumb. "I've got ways of loosening tongues." "That won't be necessary, Fletcher," Vargas said. "McGraw and I are old acquaintances. He knows I keep my promises." He fixed Elias with a cold stare. "And I promised my brother before he died that I'd make you suffer for what you did to him." Elias met his gaze steadily. "Your brother was a murderer, Vargas. Killed 3 people during that bank robbery in Tucson." "He was family," Vargas replied simply. "And you sent him to die in that hellhole prison." "So what now?" Elias asked. "You kill me, then go after Grace." Vargas smiled thinly. "Eventually, yes, but not right away. First we wait." "For what?" "For your friends to come looking for you." Vargas settled into the chair opposite Elias' revolver, resting casually on the tabletop. "The woman, the deputy, whoever else you've involved in this little crusade against Judge Calder." Elias kept his expression neutral, but inwardly he cursed. Vargas was smarter than he'd given him credit for. By holding Elias at the ranch, he'd created the perfect trap. "They won't come," Elias said. "They're following the plan. Get the evidence to Fort Gibson." "Maybe," Vargas conceded. "Or maybe they'll worry when you don't meet them as arranged. Either way, we have time." He nodded to Decker. "Secure him. We'll take turns keeping watch." Decker produced a length of rope binding Elias's hands behind the chair, then his ankles to the chair legs. The bonds were tight, cutting into his wrists. "Comfortable?" Vargas asked mockingly. "Had worse accommodations," Elias replied. "Good, because you'll be here until either your friends arrive or Judge Calder does." Vargas leaned closer. "And between you and me, McGraw, I'm hoping it's your friends, especially the woman." Judge Calder was very specific about bringing her back alive, but he didn't say what condition she needed to be in. The implied threat made Elias's blood run cold. "Touch her and I'll kill you, Vargas. That's a promise." Vargas laughed, genuinely amused. Bold words from a man tied to a chair. He stood gesturing to his men. "Fletcher, you take first watch. Decker, Jenkins, check the outbuildings again. They might have hidden something important." As the men dispersed, Vargas paused at the door, looking back at Elias with an expression almost like pity. "You know what your problem is, McGraw. You never learned when to walk away. Silver Creek should have taught you that. Now it's too late." With that, he stepped outside, leaving Elias alone with Fletcher, who settled into a chair by the window, knife in one hand, revolver in the other. Elias tested his bonds, subtly feeling for any weakness, but found none. Vargas and his men were professionals, not common outlaws. Breaking free would require time and opportunity, both in short supply. His thoughts turned to Grace and Collins, heading to Winslow in search of the journal. If they succeeded, they'd expect to meet him at Marcus's store tomorrow. When he didn't appear, would they continue to Fort Gibson without him? Or would they come looking? He hoped for the former, but feared the latter. Grace had already demonstrated a stubborn refusal to abandon those who helped her. And Collins, for all his youth and inexperience, had a strong sense of duty. Either might be reckless enough to return for him. Outside, the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the floor of the ransacked cabin. Elias sat motionless, conserving energy, watching Fletcher through half-lidded eyes, waiting for any opportunity, any mistake. Night was falling on Broken Wheel Ranch, and with it, Elias knew, came his best chance for escape if he could seize it before Grace and Collins walked into Vargas's trap. In Winslow, 20 miles away, Grace and Deputy Collins moved silently through the darkened streets toward the Whitfield residence, unaware of the danger Elias now faced, or of the deadly chain of events their search for justice had set in motion. The Whitfield house stood at the edge of Winslow's respectable district, a two-story structure with white clapboard siding and green shutters surrounded by a wrought iron fence that gleamed dully in the moonlight. From the street, it appeared peaceful, almost serene. Only the official seal on the front door marked it as a place of death and suspected murder. Grace paused in the shadows across the street, her heart hammering against her ribs. 6 days ago, she had fled this house in terror and desperation, certain she would never return. Now here she was, disguised as a young man accompanied by a deputy who was risking his career, perhaps even his life, to help her. "Are you certain you want to do this?" Collins asked quietly, noting her hesitation. Grace squared her shoulders, ignoring the persistent ache where the bullet had torn through flesh. "I have no choice." They crossed the street quickly, keeping to the shadows. Collins led them not to the front entrance, but around to the servant's door at the rear of the house. He produced a ring of keys from his pocket. "Sheriff Riley left these with me," he explained, selecting a key. "Standard procedure to secure a crime scene." The lock turned with a soft click. Collins pushed the door open, slowly, wincing at the slight creak of hinges. They stepped into the kitchen, a spacious room with a large cast-iron stove, now cold and dark. Moonlight filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the tiled floor. Grace removed her hat, running a hand through her shorn hair. Being back in this house brought a flood of memories, most of them unpleasant. Her marriage to Charles had been one of convenience, not love. He had wanted a decorative wife to enhance his social standing. She had wanted escape from the crushing poverty that had followed her father's death. Neither had found what they truly sought. "Charles's study is upstairs," she whispered. "Second door on the right." Collins nodded, drawing his revolver. "Stay close. The house should be empty, but Calder might have posted a guard." They moved through the darkened house like ghosts, their footsteps muffled by expensive carpets imported from the east. Grace led the way up the grand staircase, one hand trailing along the polished banister. At the top, she hesitated, her gaze drawn to a closed door at the end of the hallway, the master bedroom she had shared with Charles. The place where, according to the official account, she had argued with her husband before shooting him in his study. This way, she murmured, turning toward the study. The door was sealed with an official notice, which Collins carefully removed. Inside, the room was exactly as Grace remembered, yet fundamentally changed. Charles's massive oak desk dominated the space, his leather chair pushed back as if he had just stepped away momentarily. Bookshelves lined the walls filled with legal volumes and financial ledgers that Charles had consulted regularly but rarely read. And there on the Persian carpet before the desk, a dark stain spread like spilled ink, Charles's blood now dried and blackened with time. Grace swallowed hard, fighting the surge of nausea that rose in her throat. She had not killed her husband, but standing here seeing the physical evidence of his violent end shook her more than she had anticipated. "We need to work quickly," Collins said, setting a small lantern on the desk and lighting it. "Where would Charles hide something important?" Grace forced herself to focus. He was methodical, precise. Everything had its place. She moved to the desk, running her fingers along the edge. "He had a secret compartment in here somewhere. I saw him access it once, though he didn't know I was watching." She began examining the desk, systematically checking drawers, pressing panels, searching for any irregularity in the wood. Collins started on the bookshelves, pulling volumes at random, looking behind and beneath them. Minutes stretched into a quarter hour with no success. Grace's frustration mounted. The journal had to be here. It was their only hope of proving Calder's corruption and her innocence. "Wait," she said suddenly, eyes falling on the portrait above the fireplace. It showed Charles at his most pompous, standing beside his desk, one hand resting on a globe, the other holding a leather-bound book. "The painting." Collins followed her gaze. "What about it?" "It's new. Charles had it commissioned just 3 months ago." Grace crossed to the fireplace, studying the heavy gold frame. He insisted on hanging it himself, wouldn't let the servants touch it. Together, they carefully lifted the painting from its hooks. Behind it, the wall appeared solid, but when Grace ran her fingers along the seam where the wainscoting met the plaster, she felt a slight indentation. She pressed, and a small section of the wall clicked, then swung inward to reveal a hidden safe. "Clever," Collins murmured appreciatively. Charles was many things, but never careless with his secrets. Grace stared at the safe's dial. "Now we just need the combination." "Any ideas?" Grace thought for a moment. "Try 10-15-68, our wedding date." Collins knelt before the safe and carefully turned the dial right to 10 left, to 15 right to 68. He tried the handle, but it remained locked. "Another guess," he asked. Grace considered what she knew of her husband. 4/22/52, his birth date. Again, Collins tried the combination. Again, failure. Grace bit her lip, thinking harder. What number sequence would Charles use something significant yet not obvious to others? 8/29/76, she said finally. "What's that date?" Collins asked as he turned the dial. "The day his father died and left him the bank. The day Charles became, in his own words, a man of consequence." This time, when Collins pulled the handle, the safe door swung open. Inside lay several stacks of banknotes, a velvet pouch that likely contained jewelry, and most importantly, a leather-bound journal with the initials CW embossed in gold on the cover. Grace reached for it with trembling hands. "This is it." She opened the journal, Collins holding the lantern closer. Charles's neat, precise handwriting filled the pages, dates, amounts, names, and detailed descriptions of transactions that even at a glance were clearly illegal. "Land acquisitions through forced foreclosures," Grace murmured, scanning the entries. "Bribes to railroad officials to change the planned route." And here she pointed to a recurring entry labeled simply "Shipments," weapons sales to both settlers and native tribes, driving up tensions to depress land prices even further. Collins whistled softly. "This is dynamite, enough to destroy Calder's career, maybe even send him to prison." Grace turned to the final entries dated just before Charles's death. Her breath caught as she read Calder growing more reckless. "Insists on expanding weapons operation despite increased federal presence. Threatened me when I suggested caution. Must consider options for protection. Perhaps Marshal Thornton in Fort Gibson." And the final entry, written the very night Charles died, meeting with Calder tonight. We'll confront him with evidence of embezzlement from bank funds. His greed has exceeded all bounds. If he refuses to moderate his activities, I will be forced to act. God forgive me for my part in this, but I cannot continue as we have been. He was going to expose Calder, Grace whispered. That's why Calder killed him, or had him killed. And framed you for it, Collins added grimly, a convenient solution to both problems. Grace closed the journal, clutching it tightly. We have what we came for. Now we need to get this to Marshal Thornton. Collins nodded, extinguishing the lantern. We'll leave town before dawn, head straight for Fort Gibson. What about Elia? Grace asked. We're supposed to meet him at Marcus's store tomorrow. We can't risk waiting, Collins replied, though he looked troubled. Elias would understand. The evidence is what matters. Grace wanted to argue, but knew he was right. The journal in her hands was more important than any one person, even Elias McGraw, who had risked everything to help her. Let's go, she said finally. They carefully replaced the painting, erasing all signs of their presence, then made their way back through the silent house. At the kitchen door, Collins paused, listening intently before easing it open. The backyard was empty, bathed in moonlight. They slipped out, Collins relocking the door behind them, and moved quickly along the narrow alley that ran behind the houses on this street. Our horses are at the livery, Collins whispered. We'll collect them and be on our way before a sharp voice cut through the night. Hold it right there. Grace and Collins froze. From the shadows of a neighboring yard emerged a figure, a man in a deputy's uniform, revolver drawn, and pointed directly at them. Jenkins, Collins said, recognizing the man. What are you doing here? Deputy Jenkins stepped closer, his weapon unwavering. Could ask you the same, Collins, especially why you're sneaking around a crime scene with a stranger. His eyes narrowed as he studied Grace's disguise. Or maybe not such a stranger after all. That's her, isn't it, Whitfield's wife? Collins moved slightly, positioning himself between Grace and Jenkins. You don't understand what's happening here, Jenkins. Judge Calder isn't what he seems. Save it, Jenkins snapped. The judge pays my salary, not you. Now both of you hands up nice and slow. Grace met Collins's eyes briefly, a silent communication passing between them. Then in a fluid motion, Collins lunged forward, knocking Jenkins's gun arm upward just as the man fired. The shot went wild, echoing through the quiet night. Run, Collins shouted to Grace as he grappled with Jenkins. Grace hesitated only a moment before turning and sprinting down the alley, the precious journal clutched to her chest. Behind her, she heard the sounds of struggle, another shot, then silence. Her heart pounding, she ran blindly, taking turns at random, trying to put distance between herself and the Whitfield house. The streets of Winslow were largely deserted at this hour, but lights began appearing in windows as residents were awakened by the gunshots. Grace ducked into a narrow space between two buildings, pressing herself against the wall, trying to calm her ragged breathing. What had happened to Collins? Was he dead, wounded? Captured, and what should she do now? The livery was out of the question. It would be the first place they'd look for her. She needed another way out of town, and quickly. Peering cautiously around the corner, she spotted the railroad station a few blocks away. A freight train stood on the tracks, steam rising from its locomotive as it prepared for departure. If she could reach it, stow away somehow. Grace tucked the journal inside her shirt, adjusted her hat low over her eyes, and stepped out onto the street, forcing herself to walk naturally despite the urge to run. She kept her head down, shoulders hunched, playing the role of a young man heading home after a late night. A patrol of deputies passed nearby, and Grace's pulse spiked, but they hurried toward the sound of the earlier commotion without giving her a second glance. Her disguise was holding for now. At the station, activity centered around the passenger platform, where the night station master was dealing with a handful of travelers awakened by the disturbance in Pontoon. Grace slipped around to the freight platform where workers were loading the last crates onto a car. Hey you, a gruff voice called. Grace froze, then slowly turned to face a burly freight handler. You with the chamber shipment? The man asked, gesturing to a stack of crates. Grace seized the opportunity. Yes, sir. Just checking that everything's loaded proper. The man grunted. Well, hurry it up. We're pulling out in 5 minutes. Where's this train headed? Grace asked, trying to sound casual. East. Stops at Mercer Junction, then on to Capital City. The man gave her a curious look. You knew should know the route. First run, Grace replied with a shrug. Still learning. The man seemed satisfied with this explanation and moved away to supervise the loading of the final crates. Grace circled the train looking for an opportunity. Near the rear, she found an empty stock car with its door partially open. Glancing around to ensure no one was watching, she quickly pulled herself inside. The car smelled of hay and animals, though it was currently empty. Grace settled into a corner, pulling her coat tightly around her against the night chill. Outside, she heard shouts as the final preparations for departure were made. With a lurch and the hiss of steam, the train began to move. Grace closed her eyes briefly in relief. She was out of Winslow at least. But Collins, what had become of him? And Elias waiting at Broken Wheel Ranch for a meeting that would never happen. She pulled the journal from inside her shirt, running her fingers over the embossed initials. This small book contained the truth, the key to her freedom and to justice for Charles's murder. But at what cost? As the train gathered speed, carrying her away from Winslow and into an uncertain future, Grace made a silent promise to both men who had risked everything to help her. She would see this through. She would reach Marshall Thornton, and somehow she would find a way to help Collins and Elias if they still lived. The freight train rumbled eastward through the night, its rhythmic clacking a counterpoint to the tumult of Grace's thoughts and the weight of the journal against her heart. Back at Broken Wheel Ranch, Elias McGraw sat motionless in his chair watching Fletcher through half-closed eyes. The gunman had grown increasingly bored with his watch duty, occasionally stepping onto the porch for a smoke before returning to his post by the window. Outside, darkness had fallen completely. Through the open door, Elias could see Vargas and the other two men, Decker and Jenkins, gathered around a small fire near the barn. They passed a bottle between them, voices carrying on the still night air. "How long we gonna wait here?" Decker was asking. "Woman's probably halfway to Fort Gibson by now." "Judge Calder said to hold this position," Vargas replied. "Someone will come looking for McGraw eventually. And if they don't, then we take McGraw to Winslow. Judge gets back tomorrow afternoon. He'll want to deal with him personally." Elias processed this information carefully. Calder returning tomorrow meant he had less time than he'd thought. And the mention of taking him to Winslow suggested they planned to keep him alive, at least for now. Fletcher yawned, stretching in his chair. He glanced at Elias, then out the window toward his companions. "I'm getting a drink," he announced. "Don't go nowhere, old man." He chuckled at his own joke as he stepped onto the porch, leaving Elias alone in the cabin for the first time since his capture. Immediately, Elias began working at his bonds, twisting his wrists against the rope. The movement reopened the raw skin beneath, and he felt warm blood trickle down his hands, but the wetness made the rope slicker. If he could just create a little more space. Through the open door, he could see Fletcher join the others at the fire, accepting the bottle when it was passed to him. They were distracted, confident in their captive's helplessness. Elias continued working at the ropes, ignoring the pain. 20 years ago, he would have escaped these bonds in minutes. Now his older muscles protested, and progress came slower than he would have liked. A soft whine from beneath the overturned table made him pause. Carefully, he leaned forward as much as his bindings would allow, peering into the shadows. Two reflective eyes stared back at him. Tobias. The old dog was alive, though clearly injured. He whined again softly, recognizing his master. "Easy, boy," Elias whispered. "Stay quiet now." He resumed his efforts on the ropes with renewed determination. Outside, the men's conversation grew louder as the bottle made several rounds. "I'm telling you, this McGraw fella ain't worth the trouble," Jenkins was saying. "Old man like that probably can't even draw that fancy gun of his anymore." "Don't underestimate him," Vargas warned. "I've seen what he can do. 20 years ago, he was the fastest gun in 3 territories. 20 years is a long time," Decker observed. "Not long enough to forget some things," Vargas replied darkly. Fletcher laughed. "Well, he ain't doing much drawing tied to that chair. I say we have some fun with him, loosen him up before the judge gets here." Elias felt a surge of adrenaline. If they came back inside now, they'd notice his progress on the ropes. He needed more time. As if sensing his master's predicament, Tobias slowly crawled from beneath the table. The dog's right hindquarter was clearly injured, and dried blood matted his fur, but determination shone in his loyal eyes. With painful slowness, Tobias limped toward the open door. On the threshold, he paused, looking back at Elias as if seeking permission. "Go on, boy," Elias whispered. Tobias slipped outside, sticking to the shadows at the edge of the porch. Then, summoning what strength remained in his battered body, the old dog began to bark sharp, urgent sounds directed away from the cabin toward the woods. The effect was immediate. All four men jumped to their feet, hands going to their weapons. "What's he barking at?" Fletcher demanded. "Someone's out there," Vargas said, his voice suddenly tense. "Decker, Jenkins, check the woods. Fletcher, get back to McGraw." As the men scattered, Elias doubled his efforts on the ropes. He could feel them beginning to give the extra space created by his bloody wrists, allowing more movement. Just a little more. Fletcher burst through the door, gun drawn. "Shut that dog up," he snarled, moving to the window to peer into the darkness. Tobias continued barking, now moving toward the barn, drawing attention away from the house. In the distance, Decker and Jenkins shouted to each other as they searched the tree line. Elias felt the rope around his right wrist finally give way. Keeping his arms behind the chair to maintain the illusion of captivity, he worked his left hand free. Fletcher turned from the window, irritation clear on his face. "I don't see nothing out there. Dogs probably barking at shadows." He crossed to the door, raising his gun. "I'll shut him up permanent." "I wouldn't do that," Elias said, his voice dangerously calm. Fletcher turned, eyes widening as he saw Elias standing free, the ropes that had bound him lying on the floor. "How did you—" He began, swinging his gun toward Elias. He never finished the question. Elias moved with a speed that belied his years, closing the distance between them in 2 strides. His fist connected with Fletcher's jaw with a sickening crack, sending the man stumbling backward. Before Fletcher could recover, Elias delivered another blow to his midsection, doubling him over, then brought his knee up into the man's face. Fletcher collapsed unconscious before he hit the floor. Elias quickly relieved him of his revolver and knife, then moved to the window, assessing the situation outside. Decker and Jenkins were still searching the woods, their attention drawn by Tobias's continued barking. But Vargas stood in the yard, his experienced eyes scanning the cabin. He knew something was wrong. Elias weighed his options. He could try to slip out the back window, make for the woods, and circle around to retrieve his horse. But that would mean abandoning Tobias, and it would only be a matter of time before Vargas and his men tracked him down again. No, there was only one way this could end. Elias checked Fletcher's revolver, 6 shots, all chambers loaded. He tucked the knife into his boot, took a deep breath, and stepped onto the porch. Vargas spotted him immediately, his hand dropping to his holster. "McGraw," he shouted, alerting the others. "Don't be a fool." "You're trespassing on my property, Vargas," Elias called back. Fletcher's revolver held loosely at his side. "I'm giving you one chance to leave. Take your men and go." By now, Decker and Jenkins had emerged from the woods, alerted by Vargas's shout. They flanked, their leader guns drawn. "3 against 1, old man," Vargas said, a cruel smile playing at his lips. "Not good odds, even for Lightning Hand McGraw." "I've had worse," Elias replied calmly. For a moment, the night was utterly still. 4 men poised on the edge of violence, measuring each other across 20 yards of moonlit yard. Then several things happened at once. Tobias, sensing his master's peril, launched himself at Jenkins, teeth bared. Decker, startled by the dog's attack, fired wildly. And Vargas, seizing what he saw as his moment, drew his gun with practiced speed. But Elias was faster. 20 years fell away in an instant, muscle memory taking over as his arm came up in a fluid motion. Fletcher's revolver barked twice in rapid succession. Vargas staggered backward, a look of genuine surprise crossing his face as 2 red stains blossomed on his chest. His unfired gun slipped from his fingers as he collapsed to his knees, then toppled forward into the dust. Decker turned his gun toward Elias, but too late. A 3rd shot rang out, and Decker's hat flew off as he fell a neat hole in his forehead. Jenkins had managed to kick Tobias away and was raising his weapon when Elias's 4th shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. The man dropped his gun, clutching his wound and screaming in pain. "Enough!" Elias shouted, his voice cutting through Jenkins's cries. "It's over!" Jenkins stared at him, then at his fallen companions, blood seeping between the fingers clutching his shoulder. "Don't kill me," he gasped. "Please." Elias approached cautiously, keeping his gun trained on Jenkins. "Who sent you here, Calder?" Jenkins nodded frantically. "The judge hired Vargas. Said to find the woman and bring her back. Said you were dangerous, needed to be dealt with." "Why because of Silver Creek?" "I don't know about any creek," Jenkins whimpered. "Just that you were helping the Whitfield woman and the judge wanted you both." Elias knelt beside Tobias, checking the dog's injuries. The loyal animal whined softly, licking his master's hand despite his pain. "Get on your horse," Elias told Jenkins. "Ride to the doctor in redemption. Tell him I'll pay for your treatment." He paused, fixing the wounded man with a cold stare. "Then keep riding. If I ever see you again, I won't be so merciful." Jenkins needed no further encouragement. Clutching his wounded shoulder, he staggered to his horse and mounted awkwardly. With a final, fearful glance at Elias, he spurred the animal into a gallop, disappearing down the trail toward town. Elias surveyed the carnage in his yard, two dead men. One fled, one unconscious in his cabin. After 20 years of peace, violence had returned to Broken Wheel Ranch in a single night. With a heavy sigh, he gathered Tobias gently in his arms and carried the injured dog into the cabin. After settling Tobias on a blanket near the stove, Elias tied the still unconscious Fletcher securely to the chair he himself had recently occupied. Then he set about preparing for what would come next. Calder would know by morning that his plan had failed. The judge would be desperate now, dangerous in his desperation. And somewhere out there, Grace was either on her way to Fort Gibson with the evidence they needed or in Calder's clutches. Either way, Elias's path was clear. He would ride to Winslow at first light, find Marcus, and learn what had happened. If Grace had succeeded in finding the journal and escaping, he would follow her to Fort Gibson, ensuring she reached Marshal Thornton safely. And if she hadn't, if Calder had her, then Elias would do what Lightning Hand McGraw had done best. He would deliver justice one way or another. As dawn broke over Broken Wheel Ranch, Elias McGraw saddled his horse, checked his colt, and took one last look at the place he'd called home for 20 years. He didn't know if he would ever see it again, but that uncertainty bothered him less than it might have just days ago. For the first time since Silver Creek, he felt truly alive, purpose burning in his veins, clarity in his mind. The ghost that had haunted him for 2 decades seemed quieter now, as if approving of the path he'd chosen. With Tobias safely left in the care of a neighboring rancher and Fletcher secured for later collection by Deputy Collins, Elias turned his horse toward Winslow and whatever fate awaited him there. Behind him, the rising sun cast his shadow long across the ground, the silhouette of a rider, a gun on his hip, heading toward a reckoning long overdue. The town of Winslow had changed considerably since Elias last visited. What had once been a modest settlement had grown into a proper frontier hub with a 2-story hotel, multiple saloons, and brick buildings, replacing many of the original wooden structures. The railroad had brought prosperity evident in the busy streets and well-dressed townsfolk hurrying about their morning business. Elias rode in slowly, keeping his hat pulled low. After the night's violence at Broken Wheel Ranch, he knew his description would be circulating among Calder's men. Though Jenkins had fled eastward, there was no guarantee the wounded man hadn't sent word ahead. The exhausted chestnut gelding plodded down the main street, drawing little attention from passers-by. Elias studied faces carefully, noting the unusual number of armed men loitering on corners and outside businesses. Not regular townsfolk, their watchful eyes and ready postures marked them as hired guns. Calder was taking no chances. Marcus Hannigan's cousin owned a small mercantile at the edge of town, the predetermined meeting place where Elias was to rendezvous with Grace and Collins. The store stood at a quiet intersection, its faded sign proclaiming Wilson's General Goods and Sundries to anyone who cared to read it. Elias tethered his horse behind the store out of sight from the street and entered through the back door. A small bell jingled as he stepped inside, causing the portly man behind the counter to look up from his ledger. "We're not open for another," Wilson began, then stopped as he recognized his visitor. "McGraw, Marcus said you might be coming." Elias nodded, scanning the empty store. "I'm looking for my companions, young man and his nephew. They were supposed to meet me here." Wilson's expression grew grave. "No one's come, but there was trouble in town last night, gunshots near the Whitfield house. Word is Deputy Collins was involved." Elias's stomach tightened. "What happened to him?" "Taken to the jail. They're saying he was caught breaking into the Whitfield place with an accomplice." Wilson lowered his voice. "A woman disguised as a boy. She escaped." Relief and concern warred in Elias's mind. Grace had gotten away, at least for now, but Collins was captive. And if Calder's men were searching for a woman disguised as a young man, Grace's cover was blown. "Any word on where she might have gone?" Elias asked. Wilson shook his head. "None. But Judge Calder's offering $500 for information leading to her capture. Double that if she's brought in with something she stole, a book of some kind." "The journal." So Grace had found it. That was something at least. When does Calder return to town? Elias asked. This afternoon's train from Capital City, around 3 o'clock. Wilson studied Elias with concern. Marcus told me some of what's happening. Said you and the woman are trying to bring evidence against the judge. That's right. Wilson glanced nervously at the windows. Then you shouldn't be here, Mr. McGraw. Calder practically owns this town. His men are everywhere, and after what happened at your ranch last night, Elias's eyebrows rose. News travels fast. Jenkins rode through at dawn, bleeding and raving about you killing Vargas and Decker. Went straight to Calder's office, manager that snake Prescott. Wilson shook his head. They've put out the word shoot on sight if they find you. Elias absorbed this information calmly. I need to see Collins, find out what happened where Grace might have gone. That's suicide, Wilson protested. The jail's guarded by Calder's personal deputies. You wouldn't get within 20 yards. I'll find a way. Elias moved toward the door, then paused. If Grace returns here, tell her to ride for Fort Gibson. Marshal Thornton will protect her. And you? Wilson asked. Elias's weathered face revealed nothing. I have unfinished business with Judge Calder. Outside, the morning sun beat down on Winslow's dusty streets. Elias kept to side alleys and shadows, working his way toward the center of town where the jailhouse stood. As he moved, he pieced together what must have happened. Grace and Collins had succeeded in entering the Whitfield house and finding the journal, but they'd been discovered. Collins had been captured while ensuring Grace's escape. The real question was where Grace had gone. With the journal in her possession, her wisest course would be to head directly for Fort Gibson and Marshal Thornton. But would she abandon Collins? Abandon Elias himself when he failed to appear at the meeting point? Grace had proven herself both determined and loyal. Elias suspected she wouldn't flee to safety, while others remained in danger because of her. The jailhouse came into view, a solid stone building with barred windows and an American flag hanging limply in the still air. Two armed deputies stood outside, alert and watchful. More would be inside guarding Collins. A direct approach was impossible. Elias needed information, and for that he needed a different strategy. He circled back through the alleys until he reached the back of Winslow's largest saloon, the Silver Dollar. Service entrances were rarely watched, and as he'd hoped, the rear door stood propped open to allow cool air into the kitchens. Slipping inside, Elias made his way through the storage room and into the main saloon. Despite the early hour, a few patrons nursed drinks at scattered tables. The bartender, a thick-armed man with an impressive mustache, looked up as Elias approached. Bit early for serious drinking, he observed. Information's what I'm thirsty for, Elias replied quietly, sliding a gold coin across the polished wood. The bartender's eyebrows rose, but he pocketed the coin smoothly. What kind of information? The deputy they brought in last night. Collins. What's being said about him? The bartender glanced around, ensuring no one was listening. Word is he helped Whitfield's wife break into her old house. They're charging him with aiding a fugitive, obstruction of justice, maybe worse. When's his hearing? No hearing, the bartender said grimly. Judge Calder's ordered him transferred to Capital City when he returns this afternoon. Once Collins is out of local jurisdiction, he drew a finger across his throat meaningfully. Elias nodded, understanding perfectly. Once away from Winslow, Collins would suffer an accident during transport. No witnesses, no loose ends. One more thing, Elias said, placing another coin on the bar. The train schedules. When's the next eastbound? Passenger train leaves for Fort Gibson at noon. Freight train just after around 12:30. The bartender pocketed the second coin. Planning a trip? Maybe. Elias straightened, adjusting his hat. Much obliged for the conversation. Word of advice, the bartender called softly as Elias turned to leave. Whatever you're mixed up in, stranger, finish it quick. Judge Calder doesn't forgive those who cross him. Outside, Elias leaned against the saloon wall, considering his options. Collins would be moved when Calder returned at 3 o'clock. That gave Elias just under 6 hours to devise a rescue plan and locate Grace, assuming she was still in Winslow. A commotion down the street caught his attention. A crowd had gathered outside the telegraph office where a clerk was posting a notice. Keeping his hat low, Elias edged closer until he could read the bold text. Reward increased $1,000 for information leading to the capture of Grace Whitfield, wanted for the murder of Charles Whitfield and theft of private property. $1,000 for information leading to the capture of Elias McGraw, wanted for harboring a fugitive obstruction of justice in the murder of Miguel Vargas and Joseph Decker. Both fugitives considered armed and dangerous. Below the notice was a crude sketch of Grace, surprisingly accurate despite her disguise, and a rendering of Elias that must have been based on Jenkins's description. The increased bounty troubled Elias less than the realization that with every passing hour their situation grew more desperate. Calder was tightening the noose using his considerable resources to ensure neither Grace nor the journal reached Fort Gibson. As Elias turned away from the crowd, a young boy approached him, eyes wide with recognition. "Mister," the child whispered, "you're him, ain't you, the man from the poster?" Elias stiffened, hand moving instinctively toward his holster, but the boy held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I ain't telling nobody," he assured Elias. "Ma says Judge Calder's a thief who took our farm. Says anybody against him is a friend of ours." Elias studied the boy no more than 12 with earnest eyes and threadbare clothes. "What's your name, son?" Billy Tanner." The boy glanced around nervously. "I got a message for you, from a lady." Elias's heart quickened. "What lady?" "Didn't give no name. Said she was a friend of yours. Short hair, dressed like a bar, but definitely a lady." Billy fidgeted with his cap. "Found me this morning, gave me 2 bits to watch for you and deliver a message." "What's the message?" "She said to tell you she has the package you're looking for, and she'll be on the noon train. Said you should follow on the next one if you can't make that one." Billy frowned, concentrating. "Oh, and she said to tell you Silver Creek is not your fault. Said you'd understand." Relief washed through Elias. Grace was alive, had the journal, and was sticking to the plan, heading for Fort Gibson. But the noon train was just hours away, and he couldn't leave Collins to Calder's mercy. "Thank you, Billy," Elias said, pressing a coin into the boy's palm. "You've done a good service today." The boy beamed, pocketing the coin. "Need anything else? Mr. Ma runs a boarding house over on Pine Street. Safe place if you need somewhere to lay low." Elias considered the offer. He needed a secure location to plan Collins's rescue, and the streets were becoming increasingly dangerous as more of Calder's men arrived in town. "Lead the way, Billy," he decided, "but be careful. Anyone sees you with me, you could be in trouble." The boy nodded solemnly. "I know back ways. Follow me, but not too close." Billy led Elias through a maze of alleys and service passages, eventually arriving at a modest 2-story house set back from Pine Street. A hand-painted sign identified it as Tanner Boarding House. The boy's mother, Sarah Tanner, was a stern-faced woman whose expression softened when Billy explained the situation. Like many in the territory, she had suffered under Calder's corrupt practices, losing her husband's farm after his death when the judge ruled against her in a property dispute. "You can use the back room," she told Elias, showing him to a small but clean chamber with a single window overlooking an enclosed yard. "No one will look for you here." "I'm grateful," Elias said, "but I can't stay long. I need to help my friend at the jail, then catch the freight train east." Mrs. Tanner's face grew troubled. "The deputy, they've got him under heavy guard. Prescott's been boasting all morning about how the judge will make an example of him." "I still have to try," Elias insisted. "You'll need help," Mrs. Tanner said decisively. "Wait here." She returned shortly with a local dressmaker, a sheriff's deputy loyal to the absent Sheriff Riley, rather than to Calder and the telegraph operator who had once courted Mrs. Tanner's sister. All had reasons to despise Calder, and all were willing to assist in Collins's rescue. Together, they formulated a plan. The telegraph operator would send a false message from Calder to the jail ordering Collins's immediate transfer to a different location ahead of schedule. The dressmaker would create a quick disguise for Elias. The deputy, Jim Hawkins, would accompany Elias to provide legitimacy to the transfer. "It's risky," Hawkins admitted, "if they recognize you or if they verify the orders." "We don't have a choice," Elias replied. "Collins dies if we do nothing." As the conspirators dispersed to fulfill their roles, Elias found a moment alone with Mrs. Tanner. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. "You're risking everything." The woman's eyes hardened. "Because Calder took everything from me once already. My husband's land, his good name, our future. The least I can do is help someone fight back." By 11 o'clock, preparations were complete. Elias, now dressed in the formal attire of a U.S. Marshal's assistant and sporting a false beard that altered his appearance considerably, stood ready beside Deputy Hawkins. The telegraph had been sent ordering Collins's immediate transfer to a waiting carriage that would take him to meet Judge Calder at a location outside town. "Remember," Hawkins said as they approached the jailhouse. "Let me do the talking. Keep your head down and follow my lead." Elias nodded, adjusting his unfamiliar clothing. The weight of his Colt beneath the formal jacket was reassuring. He hoped they wouldn't need it, but experience had taught him to prepare for the worst. The guards at the jail's entrance challenged them immediately. Hawkins presented the telegraph, his manner authoritative and unquestioning. "Orders direct from Judge Calder," he stated. "Collins is to be moved immediately to meet the judge's private train at Mercer Junction." The guards exchanged uncertain glances. "We were told to wait until the judge returned this afternoon," one objected. "Plans change," Hawkins replied curtly. "You want to tell the judge you countermanded his direct orders." Neither guard seemed eager to face that prospect. After a brief consultation, they allowed Hawkins and Elias inside. The jailhouse was a simple structure, a front office with a desk and gun rack and a row of 3 cells along the back wall. Collins occupied the middle cell, his face bruised and swollen from what had clearly been a severe beating. He looked up as they entered, the recognition flashing briefly in his eyes when he saw Elias, but he quickly masked it. "Transfer orders for prisoner Collins," Hawkins announced to the jailer, a heavy-set man named Brock, who was known to be firmly in Calder's pocket. Brock scowled, reading the telegraph with suspicious eyes. "This is irregular. I was told specifically not to release Collins until Judge Calder arrived personally." "The judge's plans changed," Hawkins replied smoothly. "He's stopping at Mercer Junction before coming to Winslow. Wants Collins brought to him there for questioning." "And who's this?" Brock asked, gesturing to Elias. "Marshal Thornton's assistant from Fort Gibson," Hawkins lied. "Here to ensure the prisoner's secure transport." At the mention of Thornton, Brock's scowl deepened. The rivalry between Calder and Thornton was well known throughout the territory. "I don't like it," Brock declared. "I'm going to confirm these orders." He moved toward the telegraph key in the corner. Elias and Hawkins exchanged a quick glance. If Brock contacted Calder directly, their ruse would be discovered immediately. "That won't be necessary," came a new voice from the doorway. All heads turned to see Marcus Hannigan enter the jailhouse, dressed in his finest suit, his round face set in serious lines. "Mr. Hannigan," Brock acknowledged with surprise. "What brings you here?" "Bank business," Marcus replied, producing an official-looking document. "I've been authorized to release funds from the Whitfield accounts to cover the reward for Mrs. Whitfield's capture. Judge Calder requested the paperwork be completed before his return." While Brock was distracted by Marcus, Elias positioned himself closer to the cells. Collins watched him carefully, alert despite his injuries. "Where's Grace?" Elias murmured, barely moving his lips. "Freight train," Collins whispered back. "Noon, journals with her." Elias nodded imperceptibly. Their plan was still viable if they could get out of the jailhouse without raising the alarm. Marcus was doing an admirable job keeping Brock occupied with complicated banking terminology and documentation that required immediate attention. Hawkins seized the opportunity, moving to the cell with a ring of keys he'd taken from the desk. "Time to go, Collins," he said loudly enough for Brock to hear. "Judge Calder's waiting." As the cell door swung open, Brock finally grew suspicious. "Hold on," he called, turning from Marcus. "I still need to verify these transfer orders." Hawkins drew his revolver. "No, you don't." Brock froze his hand halfway to his own weapon. "What the hell, Hawkins? You're with Riley's office." "That's right," Hawkins confirmed. "And Sheriff Riley believes in justice, not whatever corruption Calder's been selling." Elias moved quickly to Collins's side, supporting the injured deputy as he stumbled from the cell. "Can you walk?" "If it means getting out of here, I can dance a jig," Collins replied through split lips. "Nobody's going anywhere," Brock declared, reaching for his gun, despite Hawkins's warning. Elias moved faster than a man his age had any right to move. In one fluid motion, he drew his Colt and brought the barrel down hard on Brock's temple. The jailer crumpled to the floor unconscious. "That won't keep him down long," Elias observed. "We need to move." The front guards, alerted by the commotion, appeared in the doorway. Hawkins raised his badge and gun simultaneously. "Official transfer. Stand aside." The guards, confronted with a uniformed deputy they recognized, hesitated just long enough for the group to push past them. Outside, Mrs. Tanner waited with a wagon, its bed covered with canvas. "Get in," she urged, helping Collins into the concealed space. "Quickly." Elias, Hawkins, and Marcus climbed in beside Collins as Mrs. Tanner snapped the reins, sending the wagon rattling down the street just as shouts erupted from the jailhouse behind them. "Where to?" Mrs. Tanner called over her shoulder. "The station," Elias replied. "We need to catch that freight train." As the wagon raced through Winslow's streets, an alarm bell began to ring from the direction of the jail. Citizens stopped to stare, and Elias caught glimpses of armed men beginning to mobilize. "We'll never make it to the station," Marcus said grimly. "They'll have it watched within minutes." "We don't need the station," Collins gasped, clutching his ribs. "Grace said the freight train stops at the water tower just outside town. Less security there." Elias nodded, recalculating. "Mrs. Tanner head for the east road toward the water tower." The woman complied, turning the wagon onto a side street that would take them toward the edge of town. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew hoofbeats and shouted orders as Calder's men organized a search. "They'll have riders spread out within minutes," Hawkins warned. "We need to split up, create confusion." "Agreed," Elias said. "Marcus, take Collins in the wagon and circle north. Mrs. Tanner, drop Hawkins and me at the next corner. We'll continue on foot toward the water tower." The plan was executed quickly. As the wagon rumbled away with Marcus and Collins, Elias and Hawkins moved through backyards and service alleys, keeping to cover whenever possible. The town thinned as they approached its eastern edge, houses giving way to scattered workshops and storage buildings. "There," Hawkins pointed ahead, "the water tower." The structure rose above the surrounding buildings, a skeletal framework supporting a large tank beside the railroad tracks. In the distance, Elias could hear the approaching whistle of the freight train. "We need to hurry," he urged. They were crossing the final open stretch toward the tracks when a shout rang out behind them. Turning, Elias saw three of Calder's men on horseback bearing down fast. "Go," Hawkins ordered, drawing his revolver. "I'll hold them off." Elias hesitated. "You'll be branded an outlaw." Hawkins smiled grimly. "Already am after that jailbreak. Now go. Find your lady friend and get that evidence to Marshal Thornton." With a final nod of gratitude, Elias sprinted for the water tower. Behind him, gunshots echoed as Hawkins engaged their pursuers, buying precious time. The freight train was slowing as it approached the water tower, its brakes squealing against the iron wheels. Elias positioned himself in the shadow of the tower, watching as the train ground to a halt. Workers moved quickly to refill the locomotive's water tanks, paying little attention to their surroundings. Elias scanned the train cars, looking for any sign of Grace. Had she managed to board in Winslow? Was she safely hidden, or had Calder's men discovered her? The water refill was nearly complete when Elias spotted movement in an empty stock car near the middle of the train. A face appeared briefly at the small window. Grace, her eyes wide with recognition as she spotted him. She gestured urgently, pointing toward the rear of the train where fewer workers were present. Elias nodded his understanding and began moving along the tracks, staying low to avoid detection. More shouts erupted from the direction of town. Glancing back, Elias saw a larger group of riders approaching, at least a dozen men, led by Prescott, Calder's office manager. The pursuit had organized, and they were heading straight for the train. Elias quickened his pace, reaching the stock car just as the train's whistle blew, signaling imminent departure. Grace had forced the sliding door open a few inches, and she extended her hand to him. "Hurry," she urged. With a final burst of speed, Elias caught her hand. As the train began to move, he pulled himself up and into the car, rolling inside just as bullets began to strike the wooden exterior. Grace slammed the door shut, dropping the heavy locking bar into place. The sound of gunfire continued, bullets splintering the wood but failing to penetrate the car's sturdy construction. "You made it," Grace breathed, relief evident in her voice. "I wasn't sure." "Neither was I," Elias admitted, catching his breath. "Collins." With Marcus heading north to draw off pursuit. Elias examined Grace closely. She looked exhausted but unharmed, still wearing her male disguise, though it was considerably dirtier than when he'd last seen her. "You found the journal." Grace patted her shirt. "Right here. Everything we need to bring Calder down." The train picked up speed, the sound of gunfire fading behind them. Through a gap in the boards, Elias could see Calder's men remounting, presumably to pursue along the parallel road. They would try to reach Mercer Junction ahead of the train. "We're not safe yet," he warned. "Calder will telegraph ahead, have men waiting at every stop." Grace nodded grimly. "Then we don't stay on until a stop. We jump before Mercer Junction, continue cross-country to Fort Gibson." It was a desperate plan, but their options were limited. The immediate danger had passed, but Elias knew that Calder would commit every resource to stopping them before they reached Marshall Thornton. As the train rattled eastward, carrying them away from Winslow and toward an uncertain fate, Elias settled against the wall of the stock car. His body ached from the exertions of the past day's old injuries protesting the abuse. Yet there was a clarity in his mind that had been absent for 20 years. "We did it," Grace said softly, sitting beside him. "We got the journal. We escaped." "So far," Elias cautioned, "but Calder's reach is long, and he'll be desperate now. Men like him are most dangerous when cornered." "You sound like you know him well." Elias's eyes grew distant. "I know his kind, men who believe power is its own justification, who see the law as a tool rather than a boundary." He glanced at Grace. "Silver Creek taught me that lesson the hard way." Grace placed her hand over his. "Billy delivered my message about Silver Creek." "He did." Elias's weathered face softened slightly. "Thank you for that." "It's the truth," Grace insisted. "What happened to James Harker wasn't your fault. Calder manipulated the evidence, manipulated you. I should have seen through it." "How could you? You trusted the system, believed in justice." Grace's green eyes held his steadily. "That's not weakness, Elias. It's what separates men like you from men like Calder." The train swayed as it rounded a curve, momentarily pressing them closer together. Elias was acutely aware of Grace's proximity, of the subtle floral scent that persisted despite her disguise in their difficult journey. "What happens after?" Grace asked softly. "If we succeed, if Calder faces justice, what then?" It was a question Elias hadn't allowed himself to consider. For 20 years he'd existed rather than lived, bound by the ghosts of Silver Creek. Now faced with the possibility of freedom from that burden, he found himself uncertain. "I don't know," he admitted. "Rebuild Broken Wheel, I suppose. Try to make peace with Thomas if he's still alive." "And me?" Grace's voice was barely audible above the train's rhythmic clatter. "Where do I go when this is over?" Elias looked at her, really looked at her. Behind the dirt and exhaustion, behind the disguise and the hardness her trials had forged, he saw something he'd thought lost to him forever: possibility. "That would depend," he said carefully, "on what you want." Grace held his gaze. "I want peace, a place where I'm not defined by Charles, by what happened in Winslow. A chance to start over." "Broken Wheel could use a woman's touch." Elias offered the words, feeling strange on his tongue. "Been just me and Tobias for too long." A small smile curved Grace's lips. "Are you offering me a job, Mr. McGraw?" "I'm offering you a home," Elias replied. "If you want it." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Then Grace's smile widened, genuine and warm. "Let's get to Fort Gibson first," she said. "Deal with Calder. Then we can talk about homes and futures." Elias nodded, settling back against the wall. She was right, of course. They were far from safe, still deep in dangerous territory, with Calder's men in pursuit and likely waiting ahead. Yet as the train carried them eastward through the afternoon, the rhythmic sway and Grace's steady presence beside him brought Elias a peace he hadn't felt in decades. Whatever came next, whether justice or further trials, he would face it with purpose, with clarity. And perhaps, for the first time since Silver Creek, with hope. 10 miles east of Mercer Junction, the freight train slowed to navigate a steep grade. The rhythmic clacking of wheels against rails decreased from a gallop to a steady walk, offering Elias and Grace their opportunity. "Now," Elias urged, sliding the stock car door open just enough to survey the terrain. Rolling hills stretched away from the tracks, dotted with scrub oak and tall grass waving in the afternoon breeze. Grace joined him at the doorway, the precious journal secure inside her shirt. "How far to Fort Gibson from here?" 25 miles, maybe 30, Elias estimated. "A full day's hard walk if we push it." They waited until the train reached a stretch where the ground sloped gently away from the tracks. Elias went first, jumping clear and rolling to absorb the impact. Grace followed seconds later, Elias catching her arm to steady her landing. The train continued its slow climb, unaware of its departed passengers. Elias and Grace scrambled up the embankment and into the cover of nearby trees, pausing to catch their breath and get their bearings. "We head southeast," Elias said, pointing toward distant hills. "Stay off the roads, avoid open country when possible." Calder will have men watching in all the main approaches to Fort Gibson. Grace nodded, adjusting her disguise and checking that the journal remained secure. You think they know we left the train? Eventually when they search it at Mercer Junction, but by then we'll have a good lead. Elias scanned the horizon, eyes narrowed against the afternoon sun. We need to move while we still have daylight. They set a brisk pace across the rolling terrain, Elias leading them along game trails and dry creek beds whenever possible. The landscape offered decent cover stands of trees, rocky outcroppings, and uneven ground that would make pursuit on horseback difficult. As they walked, Grace recounted her experiences after they'd separated, how she and Collins had found the journal in Charles's hidden safe, their discovery, and Collins's sacrifice to ensure her escape. He fought like a demon, she said admiringly, gave me just enough time to slip away while they focused on him. Wishing, Collins is a good man, Elias agreed. Better than most who wear a badge these days. Do you think he and Marcus got away? Marcus is clever. He'll have found a way to get Collins to safety. Elias hoped he sounded more confident than he felt. The odds had been stacked against their friends, but dwelling on their fate wouldn't help the current situation. By late afternoon, dark clouds began gathering on the western horizon. A summer storm was brewing, promising both blessing and curse. The rain would cover their tracks, but also make travel more difficult. We should find shelter before that hits, Elias suggested, eyeing the approaching weather. There's an old line cabin about 2 miles east. Trappers use it seasonally, but it should be empty this time of year. The wooden structure was barely visible among the trees when the first fat raindrops began to fall. By the time they reached its door, the skies had opened, drenching them in a sudden downpour. Inside the cabin was dusty but dry, a single room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn table, and narrow cot. Not exactly the Palmer house, Elias observed, looking around the Spartan accommodations. Grace smiled tiredly. After the past few days, it looks like paradise. While Grace wrung water from her clothes, Elias checked the cabin's perimeter, ensuring they were truly alone. The storm had intensified, rain drumming on the shake roof and washing away any tracks they might have left. Nature at least seemed to be on their side. Returning inside, Elias found Grace had located dry firewood stacked beside the hearth and was attempting to start a fire with damp hands and limited experience. Here, he said gently, kneeling beside her. Like this. His calloused hands worked efficiently, arranging kindling and striking a match. Soon a small flame caught, growing steadily as he added larger pieces of wood. The fire's warm light transformed the cabin, pushing back shadows and bringing a measure of comfort to their temporary refuge. Grace settled on a rough wooden chair, finally extracting Charles's journal from her shirt. The leather-bound book had survived their journey remarkably well, its pages barely dampened by their dash through the rain. Should we read it? She asked, turning the journal in her hands. I only had time to skim it in Winslow. Elias nodded, taking a seat across from her. We should know exactly what we're carrying, what Calder's willing to kill for. Grace opened the journal and together they began reading Charles Whitfield's meticulous documentation of corruption, fraud, and increasingly serious crimes. The banker had recorded everything, dates, amounts, participants, and his own growing unease with the enterprise he'd helped create. The land schemes were just the beginning. As Calder's power and ambition grew, so did the scope of his operations. The weapons trafficking was particularly disturbing, selling rifles to settlers, while simultaneously arming native tribes, deliberately stoking conflict that drove down land prices and drove out legitimate homesteaders. Listen to this. Grace said, her voice tight with anger as she read aloud. Calder suggested eliminating Mason when he threatened to expose the Lockwood Valley transaction. I objected, but Calder reminded me that we were already too deeply involved to retreat. 3 days later, Mason's body was found in the river. Suicide, according to the inquest Calder personally conducted. Murder, Elias said grimly. How many others? They continued reading the list of Calder's crimes, growing with each turned page. By the time they reached the final entries, Charles's dawning realization that he needed to stop Calder and his plan to approach Marshal Thornton, the full extent of the judge's corruption, was clear. He's built an empire on blood and lies, Grace said softly, closing the journal. And he nearly added us to his list of victims. He still might, Elias reminded her. We're not safe until this reaches Thornton. Outside, the storm raged on, rain lashing against the windows and wind howling through the trees. Night had fallen, turning the forest beyond their shelter into an impenetrable blackness. They were isolated but also hidden, at least until morning. Grace stoked the fire, adding another log. The dancing flames highlighted the exhaustion on her face, the dark circles beneath her eyes as testament to days of stress and inadequate rest. "You should sleep," Elias suggested, nodding toward the cot. "I'll keep watch." "And when will you rest?" Grace asked. "I'll manage. I've gone longer without sleep." Grace shook her head stubbornly. "We both need rest if we're going to reach Fort Gibson tomorrow. We'll take turns 4 hours each." It was a sensible suggestion, and Elias found himself too weary to argue. "Ladies first," he conceded. While Grace settled onto the narrow cot, Elias positioned himself by the window, watching the storm-lashed darkness and listening for any sound that might signal approach. The rain provided excellent cover, but also masked potential dangers. Despite his intention to remain alert, the warmth of the fire and the rhythmic drumming of rain on the roof conspired against him. Elias felt his eyelids growing heavy, his thoughts drifting. He was roused sometime later by Grace's hand on his shoulder. "Your turn," she said softly. Elias blinked, disoriented. "How long was I asleep?" "About 3 hours." Grace smiled at his confusion. "You needed it. Now take the cot while I stand watch." Too exhausted to protest, Elias moved to the simple bed, still warm from Grace's body. As he drifted toward sleep, he was vaguely aware of Grace sitting in his vacated chair, her profile outlined against the dying fire as she maintained her vigilant watch. His last conscious thought was how quickly he'd come to trust this woman he'd known for mere days. Trust her not just with his safety, but with his long-dormant hopes for something beyond mere survival. Dawn arrived with clearing skies and birdsong. Elias woke to find Grace had rekindled the fire and was heating water in a battered tin pot she'd found in the cabin. "Hope you don't mind coffee substitute," she said, gesturing to a mixture of chicory roots she'd gathered. "It's not the real thing, but it's hot." Elias accepted the crude tin cup she offered, taking a cautious sip of the bitter brew. "Had worse," he declared, which made Grace smile. They shared a sparse breakfast of jerky from Elias's pocket and wild berries Grace had gathered near the cabin. The simple meal concluded, they prepared to resume their journey. Fort Gibson was still at least 15 miles away, a full day's walk over difficult terrain. "We should reach the territorial road by midday," Elias said as they left the cabin. "From there, it's more direct to Fort Gibson, but also more exposed." Grace nodded, tucking the journal securely inside her shirt. The previous day's rain had transformed the landscape. Mud-replaced dust streams ran higher, and the world seemed freshly washed. Their boots squelched through sodden ground as they set out eastward. The morning passed uneventfully as they traversed wooded hills and forded swollen creeks. By noon, as Elias had predicted, they reached the territorial road, a wide dirt track that served as the main artery between settlements. "We'll parallel it," Elias decided, studying the open road with suspicion. "Stay in the trees, but keep the road in sight." They had covered perhaps 2 miles in this fashion when Elias suddenly raised his hand, signaling a halt. Grace froze beside him, instantly alert. "Riders," Elias whispered, pointing ahead. Through the trees, they could see 4 mounted men approaching along the road, moving at a deliberate pace. Even at this distance, their purpose was clear. These were searchers, not travelers. "Calder's men?" Grace asked softly. Elias nodded. "Likely part of a larger search pattern. They're checking the road and scanning the woods." They retreated deeper into the forest, finding cover behind a fallen oak. The riders drew closer, their voices now audible. "Waste of time," one was saying. "They're probably already in Fort Gibson." "Judge Calder says otherwise," another replied. "Says they got off the train before Mercer Junction." "That means they're on foot somewhere between here and there." "That's a lot of ground to cover. Which is why we have 20 men searching. $500 each if we find them," remember. The speaker was clearly in charge, a hard-faced man with a cavalry officer's bearing. "The woman's to be taken alive if possible. The old man doesn't matter." The riders passed their position without detecting them, continuing down the road. Elias and Grace remained motionless until the sounds of hoofbeats faded. 20 men. Grace whispered, dismay evident in her voice. "They've formed a search line." Elias nodded grimly. "And more at Fort Gibson, I'd wager. Calder's pulled out all the stops." "What do we do?" Elias considered their options. The direct route to Fort Gibson was clearly being patrolled. Attempting to bypass the search line would mean a significant detour, adding miles and hours to their journey. We keep going, he decided. Stay in the heaviest cover, move carefully. If we're lucky, we can slip between their search patterns. They continued eastward now, moving with greater caution, stopping frequently to listen for pursuers. The going was slower, but they made steady progress through the afternoon. The sun was low on the horizon when they crested a rise and caught their first distant glimpse of Fort Gibson, a cluster of buildings nestled in a bend of the Grand River, the American flag visible above the stockade. There it is. Grace breathed hope evident in her voice. We're so close. And at our most vulnerable, Elias cautioned, the approaches will be watched. They studied the terrain ahead. Between their position and Fort Gibson lay 2 miles of increasingly open country. The forest thin, giving way to scattered trees and then open grassland around the fort. Crossing undetected in daylight would be impossible. We wait for darkness, Elias decided. Make our approach after moonset. They found a defensible position in a rocky outcropping overlooking the valley and settled in to wait. The hours passed with agonizing slowness, the sun seeming to hang suspended in the western sky. When it finally began to set, painting the landscape in gold and crimson, Elias permitted himself a small measure of optimism. They had evaded pursuit, the journal was intact, and Fort Gibson with Marshal Thornton and the justice he represented was within reach. As twilight deepened into dusk, Elias noticed movement on the road below the riders approaching from the direction of Fort Gibson. He signaled Grace to remain still as he studied the newcomers through narrowed eyes. 4 men, he murmured, but not Calder's. How can you tell? Grace whispered. Military escort. Elias explained, pointing to the distinctive uniforms of 2 of the riders. That's Marshal Thornton himself in the lead. Grace's eyes widened. Thornton here, but why? Don't know, Elias admitted, but this might be our best chance. Before Grace could respond, the sound of gunfire erupted from farther down the road. The marshal's party immediately took defensive positions, weapons drawn. As more riders emerged from the trees, Calder's men, at least 8 of them, led by the hard-faced man they'd seen earlier. They're ambushing Thornton, Grace gasped. We have to help. Elias assessed the situation rapidly. The marshal was outnumbered, though his military escort provided some advantage. More concerning was the likelihood of additional attackers closing in from other directions. Stay here, he told Grace, firmly drawing his Colt. If anything happens to me, wait until full dark, then circle around to Fort Gibson. Ask for Captain Miller, he'll get you to Thornton. Elias, no. But he was already moving, descending the slope with the silent efficiency that had once made him the territory's most feared bounty hunter. Grace's protest faded behind him as he focused entirely on the conflict ahead. The ambush had devolved into a chaotic exchange of gunfire, with Thornton's party using their horses for cover, while Calder's men fired from the tree line. Elias approached from the attacker's flank, using the gathering darkness and underbrush for concealment. The first of Calder's men fell to Elias's bullet before anyone realized a new combatant had joined the fray. The second managed to turn, eyes widening in recognition before Elias's second shot found its mark. McGraw, the hard-faced leader shouted, swinging his rifle toward the new threat. Elias ducked behind a tree as bullets splintered bark around him. From the road, Marshal Thornton seized the opportunity created by the distraction, directing his men in a coordinated response that dropped 2 more attackers. Outnumbered and caught in a crossfire, Calder's remaining men began to retreat, firing as they withdrew. Their leader was last to go, pausing to shout toward Elias's position. This isn't over, McGraw. The judge owns this territory. You'll never reach Fort Gibson alive. When the sounds of their retreat had faded, Elias cautiously emerged from cover. Marshal Thornton and his men had maintained their defensive positions, weapons still trained in his direction. Identify yourself, Thornton called. Elias McGraw, he replied, holstering his Colt to show he wasn't a threat. I believe you're looking for me, Marshal. Thornton studied him for a long moment, then gestured for his men to lower their weapons. He was a tall, imposing figure with a silver-streaked beard and the weathered face of a man who'd spent decades upholding the law in unforgiving territory. McGraw, he acknowledged, you've caused quite a stir. Judge Calder has half the territory looking for you and Grace Whitfield. We have evidence of Calder's crimes, Elias explained. Charles Whitfield's journal documenting everything: land fraud, weapons, trafficking, even murder. Thornton's eyebrows rose. That would explain why Calder's suddenly so interested in a routine murder case. He glanced around. Where is Mrs. Whitfield? Elias hesitated. Old instincts of caution warring with the need to trust this man with Grace's safety. She's nearby, with the journal. Understanding crossed Thornton's face. You were being careful, smart. He gestured to the fallen ambushers. As these gentlemen demonstrate Calder's determined to silence you both. Why are you here, Marshal? Elias asked. Seems like quite a coincidence. No coincidence, Thornton replied. I received a telegraph from Deputy Collins yesterday. Said you and Mrs. Whitfield were bringing evidence against Calder and that you might need assistance. He shook his head admiringly. Collins took quite a risk sending that message. Relief washed through Elias. Collins had survived and managed to alert Thornton. Perhaps their desperate plan would succeed after all. Mrs. Whitfield, Thornton called, looking toward the hillside. You can come down now. You're under federal protection. After a moment's hesitation, Grace emerged from her hiding place and descended to join them. She still wore her male disguise, though its effectiveness had been diminished by days of hard travel. The journal was clutched protectively against her chest. Marshal Thornton, she greeted him, extending the book. This contains everything you need to know about Judge Calder's operations. Thornton accepted the journal with appropriate gravity. We should get you both to Fort Gibson. It's not safe out here, especially after this ambush. They mounted quickly, Grace riding double with one of the soldiers, Elias sharing a horse with the other. As they set off toward the fort, Thornton dropped back to ride alongside Elias. Lightning Hand McGraw, the marshal mused. Heard you'd hung up your guns years ago. I had, Elias confirmed. What changed? Elias considered the question. Silver Creek, he said finally, a debt that needed settling. Thornton nodded understanding. The Harker case, nasty business. I always thought there was something off about that prosecution. You knew about it? Elias asked, surprised. I make it my business to know about miscarriages of justice in my territory, Thornton replied. Calder's been operating with impunity for too long. This journal might finally be enough to stop him. They reached Fort Gibson without further incident, passing through the main gate into the safety of the stockade. Thornton led them directly to his office, a sparse but orderly room in the administration building. You'll be safe here, he assured them, offering chairs and pouring 3 glasses of whiskey. Fort Gibson is federal territory. Calder has no jurisdiction, and my men are loyal to the law, not to him. Grace accepted the whiskey gratefully, taking a small sip before asking, What happens now, Marshal? Thornton settled behind his desk, Charles's journal open before him. Now I read this thoroughly, prepare formal charges, and request a federal arrest warrant for Judge Maxwell Calder. He fixed them with a serious gaze. I'll need sworn statements from both of you as well. You'll have them, Elias assured him. It won't be easy, Thornton warned. Calder has powerful friends connections that reach all the way to Washington. This will be a fight. We've come this far, Grace said firmly. We'll see it through. Thornton smiled approvingly. I'll arrange quarters for you both. Rest tonight. Tomorrow we begin building the case that will end Judge Calder's reign. True to his word, Thornton provided them with comfortable accommodations in the officers' section of the fort. After days of danger and difficult travel, the simple luxury of a clean bed and hot food seemed almost unreal to Elias. Yet sleep proved elusive. He sat by the window of his quarters watching moonlight spill across the parade ground, his mind too active for rest. They had reached safety, delivered the journal set in motion, the machinery of justice, yet something felt unfinished. A soft knock at his door roused him from his thoughts. Opening it, he found Grace waiting in the hallway, similarly unable to sleep. May I come in? She asked. Elias nodded, stepping aside. Grace entered, her hair still damp from bathing, wearing a simple dress provided by the fort commander's wife. The masculine disguise was gone, revealing again the woman beneath, stronger and more determined than when he'd first found her in his barn, but still carrying the weight of all she'd endured. I couldn't sleep, she explained unnecessarily. Too much happening up here. She tapped her temple. Know the feeling, Elias agreed, offering her the room's only chair, while he leaned against the windowsill. For a moment they sat in companionable silence, the events of the past days settling around them like dust after a storm. What do you think will happen to Calder? Grace finally asked. If there's any justice, he'll hang, Elias replied. But Thornton's right men like Calder have connections, ways of avoiding the consequences of their actions. Then we have to make sure the evidence is too strong to ignore, Grace said with determination. Our testimonies, the Journal Collins's statement, it might be enough, Elias conceded, but Calder won't go down without a fight. He'll deny everything, claim the journal is a forgery, try to discredit us as witnesses. Grace's expression hardened. Let him try. I know the truth, so do you. Truth doesn't always prevail, Grace. Elias's voice carried the weight of his experience at Silver Creek. Sometimes the system fails. Then we make sure it doesn't fail this time. She stood crossing to stand before him. You said once that Silver Creek taught you to walk away, but you didn't walk away from this. You didn't walk away from me. Elias met her gaze, seeing in her eyes a reflection of his own journey from despair to purpose. No, he agreed softly. I didn't. Why? The question was simple, direct, but loaded with meaning. Elias considered his answer carefully. Because 20 years ago, I let Calder twist justice into something ugly. I carried that weight every day since. He paused, searching for words. And because when I found you in my barn, I saw someone who deserved better than what the world had given her. Grace's hand found her fingers warm against his weathered skin. And now, with the journal delivered and Thornton building his case, now we see it through, Elias said. Make sure Calder faces justice for what he's done. And after all, her voice grew softer. What then, Elias? The question hung between them, filled with possibilities neither had dared fully acknowledge during their desperate flight. Elias found himself at a crossroads, the path backward to his solitary existence, at Broken Wheel, or forward into something unknown, but infinitely more alive. After, he began slowly. I go home, rebuild what Calder's men destroyed. He turned his hand to clasp hers more firmly. I meant what I said before. There's room at Broken Wheel if you want it. Grace's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. I think I might, she said, though I know nothing about ranching. You'll learn, Elias assured her, and I could use the company. Tobias isn't much for conversation. Their quiet laughter was interrupted by urgent footsteps in the hallway, followed by a sharp knock. Thornton entered without waiting for a response, his face grim. We have a problem, he announced. Judge Calder has just arrived at the fort's main gate demanding to see me. He's brought 20 armed deputies and a warrant for your arrests. Elias straightened, instantly alert. He can't serve warrants on federal property. Ordinarily, no, Thornton agreed, but he's claiming jurisdiction under a special territorial provision. It's questionable legal ground, but he's creating a scene threatening to return with federal marshals of his own. What do we do? Grace asked, her hand tightening around Elias's. Thornton's expression was resolute. We face him. Now, together. He gestured to the journal on his desk. I've read enough to know Calder's guilty of crimes that merit the gallows. If he wants a confrontation, I'm ready to give him one. He'll be desperate, Elias warned. A desperate man is unpredictable. That's why I want you both with me, Thornton replied. Let him see that his intimidation has failed, that his victims are prepared to testify against him. Grace drew herself up, determination replacing fear. I'll face him. He's taken enough from me, my husband, my reputation, nearly my life. I won't hide from him now. Elias nodded his agreement. Let's finish this. They followed Thornton through the fort to the main gate where Judge Maxwell Calder waited with his entourage. Seeing him for the first time, Elias was struck by how ordinary the man appeared, medium height, immaculately dressed with silver-streaked dark hair and a neatly trimmed beard. Only his eyes revealed his true nature, cold, calculating, devoid of compassion. Those eyes widened slightly as he registered Elias and Grace standing beside Marshal Thornton. Marshal, Calder greeted him with forced cordiality. I see you've apprehended the fugitives I've been seeking. I appreciate your cooperation in this matter. These people are under federal protection, Judge Calder, Thornton replied evenly. They've brought serious allegations against you supported by substantial documentary evidence. Calder's mask of civility slipped momentarily before he regained control. Allegations from a woman who murdered her husband and a washed-up bounty hunter with a grudge. Hardly credible witnesses. Marshal, the evidence speaks for itself, Thornton said, holding up Charles's journal. Your business partner documented everything, Judge. Land fraud, weapons trafficking, multiple murders including, I suspect, his own. A forgery, Calder dismissed, obviously manufactured by these two to deflect attention from their own crimes. He produced an official-looking document. I have a warrant for their arrest signed by Territorial Judge Harmon. You have no authority to interfere in territorial matters. This is federal jurisdiction, Thornton reminded him, and the crimes detailed in this journal fall under federal law. I've already telegraphed Washington requesting a warrant for your arrest, Judge Calder. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Calder's face. He had clearly expected intimidation to work, hadn't anticipated that Thornton would already be building a case against him. You're making a serious mistake, Marshal, Calder warned, his voice hardening. I have friends in Washington who won't look kindly on this overreach. Perhaps, Thornton conceded, but they might reconsider when they see what's in this journal. Your friends will distance themselves quickly once they understand the extent of your crimes. Calder's composure cracked further. This is absurd. You're taking the word of murderers over a respected judge. I'm taking the word of evidence, Thornton corrected. Charles Whitfield's own records corroborated by witness statements and financial documents my office has been gathering for months. This revelation clearly shocked Calder. Months? You've been investigating me for months. Ever since the Mason suicide, Thornton confirmed. We just lacked sufficient evidence to move against you. Until now. Calder's face flushed with anger. His hand moved toward his coat where Elias suspected a weapon was concealed. Don't, Elias warned quietly. It's over, Calder. The judge's eyes locked with Elias's recognition and hatred burning in equal measure. Lightning Hand McGraw, he sneered, still trying to atone for Silver Creek for sending an innocent man to the gallows. James Harker was innocent, Elias acknowledged, because you manufactured evidence against him, just like you tried to frame Grace for her husband's murder. You can't prove any of this, Calder insisted, though his confidence was clearly shaken. We can and we will. Grace stepped forward, her voice steady and clear. Charles kept records of everything, Judge. Every meeting, every transaction, every threat you made. Even your discussion the night before his murder when you demanded he destroy his records. And when he refused, Elias continued, you had him killed, made it look like his wife did it in a domestic dispute. Convenient solution to both problems. Calder's control finally shattered. With a movement born of desperation, he drew a hidden derringer from his coat, aiming not at Thornton or Elias, but at Grace. If I'm ruined, he snarled, she doesn't walk away. Time seemed to slow. Elias saw the weapon, saw Calder's finger tightening on the trigger, saw Grace's eyes widen in alarm. Without conscious thought, his hand dropped to his Colt, the motion so practiced it seemed to happen of its own accord. Two shots rang out almost simultaneously. Calder's derringer discharged into the ground as Elias's bullet struck his shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees. The judge's deputies, seeing their leader fall, reached for their weapons, but froze as Thornton's men leveled rifles at them from the fort walls. The next man who draws dies, Thornton announced with calm authority. Surrender your weapons. All of you are under arrest for conspiracy and attempted murder. Outnumbered and outgunned, Calder's men complied, placing their weapons on the ground. Medics rushed to attend to the wounded judge who stared at Elias with undisguised hatred. This isn't justice, Calder spat. This is revenge. No, Elias corrected him, holstering his gun. Justice is what you'll face in a federal court with evidence presented and witnesses heard. Justice is what James Harker never received. He glanced at Grace standing tall and unharmed beside him. Justice is what you tried to deny this woman. As Calder was carried away for treatment and his men were led to the fort's jail, Thornton approached Elias and Grace. It's really over, Grace said, disbelief and relief mingling in her voice. The legal proceedings will take time, Thornton cautioned. There will be a trial testimony required from both of you. But yes, Calder's power is broken. His crimes will be exposed. Silver Creek is finally settled, Elias said quietly, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that he'd carried for 20 years. And Charles can rest in peace, Grace added. Thornton nodded approvingly. You've both shown remarkable courage. The territory owes you a debt of gratitude, though few will ever know the full extent of what you've done. As dawn broke over Fort Gibson, bathing the stockade in golden light, and Elias and Grace stood together on the parade ground, watching the new day begin. The path that had brought them here from a chance encounter at Broken Wheel Ranch to this moment of resolution seemed both impossibly long and surprisingly brief. So, Grace said, breaking the comfortable silence between them, Broken Wheel Ranch. Elias turned to her, seeing not the frightened, wounded woman he'd found in his barn, but a partner who'd proven her strength and courage through fire and danger. If you still want it, he replied. Grace's smile was answer enough. I believe you mentioned it needed a woman's touch. Desperately, Elias agreed, his own smile softening the weathered lines of his face. Though I should warn you, Tobias snores. Her laughter, free and genuine, was perhaps the most beautiful sound Elias had heard in 20 years. As they walked together toward the fort's mess hall for breakfast, his hand found hers, a simple gesture that promised more than words could express. Behind them lay Silver Creek and its ghost, Calder's corruption, and the desperate journey that had brought them together. Ahead lay Broken Wheel Ranch rebuilding and the possibility of a shared future neither had dared imagine just days before. For Elias McGraw, the final frontier wasn't the untamed territory he'd spent decades traversing, but the courage to begin again, to open his solitary life to another soul. As the morning sun warmed his face and Grace's hand remained steady in his, he knew with quiet certainty that some journeys were worth every hardship endured along the way.